The man didn't knock. He never knocked. That was the thing about Harlan Briggs, Calder Voss's head collector. He walked into places like he already owned them, like the air itself owed him something. He shoved open the door of Mae Tilson's dry goods store on a Tuesday morning, boots loud on the floorboards, and he didn't say hello. Didn't tip his hat. He dropped a single sheet of paper on her counter like it was trash he was done carrying, and he said, flat as a dead man's voice, "You've got until sundown Friday. After that, we take the building." Mae was 61 years old. She'd built that store with her late husband over 30 years. Her hands were shaking when she picked up that paper. The debt written on it was for an amount she had never borrowed. If you were standing in her shoes, if that paper landed in front of you, what would you do? That question hung over Black Hollow like smoke that never quite cleared. And on the same Tuesday morning that Harlan Briggs ruined Mae Tilson's day, a man nobody knew rode into town on a black horse, carrying nothing but a canteen that was nearly empty and a name he didn't offer to anyone. His name was Riven Cross, and he had no idea what he was riding into. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, something about fighting back when the odds are stacked wrong, hit that subscribe button and follow this channel. Every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, human, and worth your time. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's ride. The first thing Riven noticed about Black Hollow wasn't the buildings or the people. It was the quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. Not the kind you get out on open range when the wind dies and the world holds its breath in a way that feels almost holy. This was a different kind. The kind where people talk in low voices even when there's no one close enough to hear them. Where a man sweeping his front steps stops sweeping when a stranger rides past and doesn't start again until the stranger is well out of sight. Riven had ridden through enough towns to know the difference. He felt it the way you feel weather coming. Not by seeing it, but by something that moves along the back of your neck. Shadow felt it too. The horse's ears went forward and stayed there. "Easy," Riven said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or to himself. He pulled up at the trough near the center of town, which was the only reason he'd come into Black Hollow at all. 2 days since his last good water source. The canteen had been dry since morning. Shadow needed water worse than he did, and that settled it. Town or no town, quiet or no quiet, they were stopping. He swung down from the saddle and let Shadow drink. Riven crouched beside the trough and splashed water on his face, rubbed the trail dust off the back of his neck. He was 38 years old and felt older in his joints, younger in his instincts. He wore a coat that had been brown once and was now the color of everything, dust and sweat and miles. The gun on his hip was not ornamental. He wasn't looking for trouble. He had not been looking for trouble in a very long time, which was part of why he kept moving. Trouble in his experience had a way of finding men who stood still. I was thinking about this, idly, the way you think about a thing you've thought about too many times, when he heard boots on the boards behind him. He didn't turn around right away. He'd learned not to turn around right away. Men who spun at every sound behind them tended to end up shooting each other by mistake. "That your horse?" The voice belonged to a man who had rehearsed being threatening. There was a quality to it, slightly too loud, slightly too deliberate, that told Riven this was a performance. He stood up slowly, turned around. 3 men. The one who'd spoken was built like a man who'd been strong in his 30s and was now mostly bulk, heavy through the shoulders, soft at the middle, with a face that had learned to look mean because mean was useful. He wore a vest with a pin on it that didn't belong to any office Riven had ever seen. The other 2 stood slightly behind him, the way dogs stand slightly behind the one dog they've decided is in charge. "It is," Riven said. "Got papers on it?" Riven looked at the man for a moment. "Papers. Bill of sale. Proof of ownership. We've been tracking a stolen animal matching that description. Black stallion, 3 white socks." The man glanced at Shadow with the look of someone making up their mind about something they've already decided. "That's him." Shadow had 4 white socks and always had, but Riven let that go for now. "Horse isn't stolen," Riven said. "Horse is mine." "We've got documentation says different." The man, Harlan Briggs, though Riven didn't know his name yet, reached inside his vest and produced a folded paper. He held it up without offering it. "Bank's got a lien. Animal was posted as collateral on a debt 2 years back. Debt went unpaid. We're here to collect. The two men behind him shifted their weight. Not aggressive yet, just ready. Riven looked at the paper, which Harlan had now lowered without ever letting Riven read it. He looked at Shadow, who was still drinking, indifferent to the conversation. He looked at the faces of the people on the street nearby, because there were people nearby, 3 or 4 of them, and not one of them met his eyes. They were all looking somewhere else, at the ground, at the sky, at the windows of buildings. That told him something. "I'll need to see what that paper actually says," Riven said. "You can see it at the bank." Harlan took one step forward. "Right now you can hand over that animal and walk." "No," Riven said. The word was quiet. There was nothing theatrical about it. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't raise his voice. He just said no the way a man says no when he means it completely, and that was somehow worse than shouting. Harlan stopped. His jaw moved like he was chewing something. "You understand what you're—" "Show me the paper." Riven held out his hand. "Right here, in front of everyone." Harlan Briggs glanced at the people on the street. They were still looking away. He seemed to calculate something. Then he looked back at Riven, and his face had changed. The performance was gone, replaced by something flatter and colder. "That's not how this works." "Then we have a problem," Riven said, "because I'm not handing over my horse based on a paper I can't read that claims a debt I don't owe. So either you show me what that document actually says, or you leave." "Or," Harlan said, and he let the word sit there a moment, "we don't." The two men behind him had stopped being relaxed. Riven Cross had been in moments like this before. He had been in moments worse than this. The thing he had learned, over years of arriving in places wrong and leaving in a hurry, was that the moment before the moment was where everything was decided. Not the draw, not the shot, not the consequence, the moment before, the breath before, the choice. He did something that surprised Harlan Briggs. He turned away from him, turned toward the people on the street, a woman near a doorway, a man with the broom he'd stopped using, an older man sitting on a barrel doing nothing. And he raised his voice. "Anybody here know this man?" he called. Nobody answered. "Anybody here know what bank he works for?" Silence. "Anybody here ever seen this same paper shown to someone else in this town?" The woman in the doorway flinched, just slightly. But it was enough. Riven looked back at Harlan. "Seems like you've done this before." Harlan Briggs' face had gone the color of old brick. "You're making a mistake." "I've made plenty," Riven said. "This isn't one of them. You want that horse? You bring something real. A judge, a marshal, somebody who isn't standing here with 2 hired men behind him waving a paper he won't let me read. Until then, get off this street." It should not have worked. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't work. One man, no authority, nothing but words, and the particular way he said them. But Harlan Briggs was, beneath the bulk and the practiced meanness, a man who worked best when the other person was afraid. And Riven Cross was not afraid. It confused him in a way that was almost physical, like trying to push against a wall that wasn't there. He said something low to the two men. Then he folded the paper back into his vest. Then he walked away. Riven didn't relax. He stood still and watched until all 3 of them were out of sight. Then he exhaled slowly, picked up Shadow's reins, and looked for somewhere to stay. The man who offered him a stall for Shadow was named Gideon Pike. He was old, somewhere past 70, with hands that looked like they'd been used hard for all of it, and a voice that had the particular dryness of a man who'd cut away everything unnecessary a long time ago. He watched Riven settle Shadow into the stall without saying much, just handed over a water bucket and a measure of grain and waited. "Those men," Gideon said finally when Riven came back out. "Briggs and his boys. That the name?" "That's the name." Gideon leaned against the stall door. "You know what you just did?" "Said no," Riven said. "Not many people do that." "I noticed." Gideon was quiet a moment. He looked at Shadow, who was eating with the single-minded contentment of an animal that had decided its problems were over for now. "You passing through?" he asked. "Was planning on it," Riven said. "Was?" "Yeah." Gideon nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something he'd been working out. He looked like a man who had opinions he'd trained himself not to have, and they were trying to surface anyway. "Calder Voss owns that bank," he said. He also owns most of the businesses on this street. The feed store, the hotel, the telegraph office. He doesn't actually own the land under most of them, but he owns the debt on it. All the debt. How? Riven asked. Carefully. Gideon said the word like it tasted bitter. He's been doing it for years. A man comes in short one season. Bad harvest, sick livestock, whatever. Voss offers a loan. Reasonable terms on paper. But the paper's got things in it that the man didn't know to look for. Clauses. Default triggers that kick in for reasons that have nothing to do with whether you're paying. Property that gets listed as collateral without the borrower understanding it's being listed. And when the trigger gets pulled, Briggs shows up with the paper. And people pay. Or they lose whatever Voss wants them to lose. Riven was quiet. He thought about the woman in the doorway who had flinched, about the man who'd stopped sweeping, about how none of them had looked at him. The sheriff, he said. Where does he fall in all of this? Gideon's face did something complicated. Elias Ward, he said. Good man once. Knew his job, knew why it mattered, but Voss has been working on him for years too. Not with a gun, with... He stopped, searched for the word. With weight, just pressure, constant, until a man bends a certain way and doesn't know how to unbend. He looks the other way. He looks away, Gideon said. There's a difference. He doesn't pretend he doesn't see it. He just stopped knowing what to do about it. Stopped believing he could do anything. That's worse, maybe. Riven thought about that for a while. Voss is going to come after you, Gideon said. It wasn't a warning, it was just information. Not today, maybe. He doesn't move fast, he's patient. But you embarrassed Briggs in front of the whole street, and Briggs goes back to Voss with everything. By tonight, Voss will know your name, your horse, and what direction you came from. Probably, Riven said. You could leave tonight, Gideon said. Get back on the road. Voss's reach doesn't go far outside the territory. Could, Riven agreed. Gideon looked at him. But you're not going to. Riven didn't answer right away. He leaned against the stable wall and looked up at the sky through the gap in the boards. Late afternoon light, the kind that turns everything orange and makes shadows long. What's the man's real weakness? He asked. Gideon blinked. What? Voss. A man like that, he's careful with the money, careful with the paper. But something runs underneath all of it. There's always something he can't hide as well as he thinks he can. Riven looked at him. What is it? Gideon was quiet for a long time, long enough that Riven thought he wasn't going to answer. The records, Gideon said finally, low. He keeps everything, every transaction, every loan, every debt. He has to. That's the whole mechanism. It only works because it's documented. But the real records, not the ones he shows the bank examiners, those are somewhere nobody's supposed to know about. And if somebody found those... He stopped. Where? Riven asked. I don't know exactly. Gideon looked uncomfortable. But a man named Damon Reed might. He worked for Voss for 3 years. Close in. Did things he's not proud of. He's been trying to be done with it for the past year, but Voss doesn't let people just walk away. Riven filed that name away. Get some sleep, Gideon said. He said it like a man who knows the next day is going to be harder than this one. Room above the stable's empty. It's not much. It's enough, Riven said. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did in new places. Habit, not fear. He lay on the cot above the stall and listened to shadow moving below, the familiar sound of the horse shifting his weight, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about the paper Harlan Briggs had waved in his face. He thought about the way Briggs had held it up but never extended it. That was the tell. A real document, one that would hold up, one a man was confident in. You let the other person read it. You put it in their hands because the document was the authority and the authority was the point. You only kept it out of reach when the document wouldn't survive being read. The whole thing was a theater of legitimacy, legal-looking paper, official-sounding language, men with a practiced look of authority. It worked because most people, when they see something that looks like law, feel like law is bigger than they are, because most of the time it is. But law is also just paper. And paper, when you held it up to the right light, showed you what it actually was. Riven Cross had learned this the hard way, years ago, in a different territory, with a different kind of injustice. He'd been younger then, and stupider, and he'd done things in response to it that he wasn't proud of. He wasn't here to repeat that. He was older now, and different, and the things he'd learned in the years between then and now had cost him enough that he meant to use them. He fell asleep sometime around midnight. Outside, the town was quiet. The wrong kind of quiet. Calder Voss heard about the incident at the water trough before supper. He was a contained man. People who met him for the first time often said he seemed reasonable, well-dressed, measured in his speech, careful with his words. The reasonableness was real in its way. Voss had simply learned that unreasonable men created witnesses. Reasonable men created paperwork, and paperwork lasted longer. He sat at his desk in the office behind the bank and listened to Harlan Briggs describe the stranger while keeping his face entirely neutral. Briggs had not wanted to describe the stranger. Briggs had wanted to describe a plan for dealing with the stranger, which was different. Voss had made him slow down. Briggs searched for the word. He said no. Yes, Voss said. People don't just... No, Voss agreed. They don't, which tells us something. He tapped one finger on the desk. Once, twice, a measured rhythm. He's not from here. He doesn't know what we are or how we work, but he read the situation correctly and responded to it, which means he's been in similar situations before. He paused. He's not a fool. He had a gun, Briggs said. Most men have guns, Voss said. That's not interesting. He turned to look out the window at the dark street. What's interesting is that he didn't use it. He used the audience instead. Another pause. Find out what his name is. Find out where he came from, and leave the horse alone for now. Briggs blinked. Leave? The horse was a pretext, Voss said. We use pretexts when we have documentation that supports them. We don't have documentation on that animal. Briggs, you showed a man a paper that won't survive scrutiny in a courtroom, and he knew it. Drop it. He turned back to the desk. We'll find another angle. Briggs left. Voss sat alone in the quiet and thought. He had not built what he'd built by losing his patience over individual confrontations. He had built it by being systematic, by being more patient than the other person, by finding the specific weak point in every person who stood in his way and pressing it, carefully, until they gave way. Everyone had a weak point. The question was simply what Riven Cross's was. He picked up his pen and went back to work. Riven was at the table in Gideon's stable the next morning, drinking coffee that was mostly boiled ambition, when Damon Reed walked in. He came in the way men come in when they've been standing outside arguing with themselves about whether to come in at all. He was younger than Riven had expected, mid-30s maybe, lean through the face in a way that looked recent, like he'd been eating badly or thinking too hard. He had the physical stillness of a man who'd spent time doing work where you needed to be still. But his eyes moved a lot, taking inventory, checking exits. He looked at Riven for a long moment without sitting down. Gideon says you want to know about the records, he said. Gideon talks a lot for a man of few words, Riven said. He trusts people he decides to trust. Damon pulled out a chair but didn't sit, just stood behind it, hands on the top. I'm not sure I trust you. You don't know me, Riven said. Sensible. Why are you still here? Water trough was right, Riven said. I'm thinking about other things too. Damon looked at him. What things? Riven set down his coffee cup. He said it simply, without drama. Voss isn't going to stop. He's going to do to someone else tomorrow what he tried to do to me yesterday. And the day after that, he'll do it again. I don't know what's in those records, but I know that the way men like Voss operate, they have to document everything, because the documents are the weapon. They use paper like other people use guns. He looked at Damon steadily. Paper leaves evidence. Damon sat down. He didn't do it gracefully. He sort of folded into the chair like a man whose body had made the decision before his head was ready. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his thumbs against his temples. I worked for him 3 years, he said. I handled things he didn't want his name directly on. I knew what I was doing. I told myself it was just business, that the men losing their land would have lost it anyway to someone else, that I was just a part of the mechanism. He stopped. His jaw was tight. I'm not asking you to justify it, Riven said. I'm asking about the records. Damon looked up. Something shifted in his face. Relief, maybe, that he wasn't going to be required to perform his own contrition right now. He keeps a second set, he said. Not in the bank. There's a room above the hardware store on the eastern edge of town. Macon's Hardware. Voss owns the mortgage on it, and Macon is scared enough that he gives Voss use of the space. The real ledgers are there, names, amounts, the actual terms of every transaction, not the terms shown to the borrowers, but the real ones. Dates of when he triggered defaults, and why. Everything. Riven was very still. You've seen them? I helped him move them once, Damon said. A year and a half ago, He stopped. Before I got done. Can you get into that room again? Maybe. Damon looked uncomfortable. Voss has a man there sometimes. Rotates. Not always the same man. Riven nodded slowly. He was running the thing through his head. The room, the access, what they'd need, what could go wrong. A lot could go wrong. A lot of it involved guns, which he'd prefer to avoid. Some of it involved timing, which was harder to predict. There's something else, Damon said. Riven looked at him. Voss isn't just doing this in Black Hollow. Damon said it quietly, like he was still deciding whether to say it. The same system, the loans, the false defaults, the documents. He's been doing it in 3 other towns I know of. Maybe more. He has connections at the territorial level, judges, someone in the land office. He paused. It's not just a man stealing from a town. It's a system. Riven sat with that for a moment. How long have you known all of this? He asked. Longer than I should have stayed quiet, Damon said. The answer landed in the room, and neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, the town was waking up. Boots on boards, a cart rolling past, someone calling to someone in a voice too distant to make out words. The ordinary sounds of a place where something ugly ran just below the surface of every ordinary thing. You said there's a man there sometimes, Riven said. What's the usual rotation? Tuesday nights, the room tends to be empty, Damon said. Briggs runs collections on Tuesday, all day and into evening, keeps the available men busy. Voss doesn't move extra security on a collection day. He thinks it makes the operation look too visible. Today's Tuesday, Riven said. Damon looked at him. Yes. Tonight then, Riven said. Damon was quiet for a moment, then, You're not worried about what happens if it goes wrong. I'm very worried about what happens if it goes wrong, Riven said. But I'm more worried about what happens if we don't try. Damon looked at the table. His hands had stopped moving. They were flat on the wood, still. He was a man who'd done things he wasn't proud of, and he knew it, and there was no way to walk back 3 years. But there was tonight. All right, he said. From the stall at the back of the stable, Shadow made a low sound. Not a whinny, just a breath, the kind of sound the horse made when the world around him felt like it was about to shift. Riven picked up his coffee cup. It was cold now, and not good when it was hot, but he finished it anyway. Tell me everything about that room, he said. Every detail you remember. And Damon Reed began to talk. Sheriff Elias Ward saw them talking through the stable window. He hadn't meant to be watching. He'd come down the alley behind Gideon's place for no reason he could have articulated except that he'd known, somehow, the way you know things in a small town, that the stranger was still there, and that Gideon wasn't the type to let a man of that kind just pass through without conversation. He stood in the alley and watched through the gap in the boards, and he saw Damon Reed's hands on the table, and the way the stranger leaned in to listen, and something moved in his chest that he recognized as something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had been Elias Ward, sheriff, for 11 years. He had believed in the job when he took it. He still believed in it, technically, in some locked-up part of himself that Voss's years of pressure hadn't reached yet, or hadn't reached all the way. But belief without action was just a feeling, and Elias had been having the feeling without taking the action for long enough that the feeling was starting to taste like shame. He watched the stranger. He watched Damon Reed. He turned and walked back up the alley. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but something had moved in his chest, and it was going to keep moving, and he knew, with the particular certainty of a man who has ignored himself too long, that he was running out of time to keep ignoring it. Somewhere across town, Calder Voss was at his desk, patient as ever, looking for angles. And somewhere in a stable, a man who'd just arrived and had no reason to stay was planning something careful and dangerous and possibly right. The town of Black Hollow held its breath. and for the first time in years, the breath wasn't all coming out on Voss's side. Damon Reed had a particular way of remembering things he'd rather forget. He'd close his eyes halfway, not all the way, just enough to dull the present, and he'd talk in a low, even voice, like reading from a document that existed only in his head. He remembered the room above Macon's Hardware the way you remember a place you visited during a bad period of your life. Every detail was sharp, because everything from that time was sharp, preserved in the specific clarity of shame. 2 rooms, he said. You go up the side stairs. The ones on the east wall, not through the main store. Top of the stairs there's a landing, then a door. Door has a padlock, not a deadbolt. Voss uses padlocks because he can change the combination without a locksmith. Inside left wall, there's a cabinet. Oak, dark. 3 drawers locked with keys. He paused. Voss keeps the keys. Where? Riven asked. On him. On his person. I've never seen him leave them anywhere. Damon opened his eyes fully. That's the problem. Riven looked at him. Then we need to get in without the keys. The drawers are good wood, Damon said. You'd need a pry bar and time. Or someone who knows how to pick a lock, Gideon said from the other side of the stable. He'd been quiet long enough that both men had half forgotten he was there. He didn't look up from what he was doing, cleaning a harness that didn't particularly need cleaning. I'm not saying I know anyone like that. But you might, Riven said. Gideon set the harness down. He looked at Riven with the tired patience of a man who has spent decades deciding exactly how much to involve himself in things, and has mostly chosen less, and is now reconsidering. My late wife's brother, he said. Ben. He lived a complicated life before he settled. Showed me a few things. You can do it? Riven asked. I can do it slow, Gideon said. I'm not a young man. Give me time and quiet. I can get into most drawers. Damon looked between them. You're both going to do this. Unless you've got a better idea, Riven said. Damon didn't. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture that looked like something he did when he was out of arguments with himself. All right, he said, but there's something else I need to tell you about the schedule. He laid it out carefully. Briggs and 4 of his regulars would be running collections until past dark. That was the easy part. What made it complicated was that Voss had a habit of walking the town himself on Tuesday evenings. Not for any official reason. He just walked. He said it helped him think, and maybe it did. But Damon had always suspected it was also a form of surveillance. Voss checking the temperature of his territory with his own 2 feet. What time does he walk? Riven asked. Varies. Between 7 and 9, usually. An hour, maybe a bit more. He goes up one side of the main street and down the other, then cuts through the alley behind the feed store, then comes back. So he'd pass within a block of Macon's. Yes. Riven thought about this. We go in at 7. If he starts his walk at 7, we're in the room before he reaches that end of town. If he starts at 9, we're out before he comes back around. And if he starts at 8, Damon asked, then we work faster. Damon looked at him for a long moment. You've done this kind of thing before. It wasn't quite a question. I've been in situations that required improvisation, Riven said. It's not the same as having a plan, but it's close enough. The day moved the way days move when you're waiting for the night. Slowly at the front end, then faster than you wanted near the back. Riven spent the afternoon watching the town without looking like he was watching it. He walked the main street once, unhurried, stopping at the general store for nothing he particularly needed, a tin of tobacco he didn't use, a length of rope that he did. And he paid attention to where people looked and where they didn't. He counted doorways. He noted which buildings had alleys between them wide enough for a man moving quickly. He looked at the hardware store from a distance and found the eastern stairs Damon had described, tucked against the building's wall, partially shielded from the street by a stack of old lumber that had been there long enough to weather gray. He went back to the stable. He checked Shadow. The horse was fine, comfortable, eating with the contented focus of an animal that had decided its rider would handle whatever needed handling. Riven ran his hand along the horse's neck and felt some of the tension go out of his own shoulders. Not all of it, but some. Around 4 in the afternoon, a boy came to the stable. 12, maybe 13, with the look of a child who has learned to make himself small. He said his name was Henry and that he worked for Gideon sometimes, and he stood in the doorway with a look that suggested he had something to say and was calculating the cost of saying it. Riven waited. "Mr. Voss came into the dry goods store today," the boy said finally, "where my mother works." "What did he want?" "He was asking about you." Henry looked at the floor. "He knew your name already. He was asking how long you were staying and whether you'd said anything to my mother." Riven considered this. "What did she tell him?" "That she didn't know." Henry looked up. "She doesn't, but she knew to say it that way instead of—" He stopped. "Mr. Voss makes people careful about what they say." "He does," Riven agreed. "Your mother do all right?" "She's scared," Henry said. It was a plain statement, without drama. "She's always scared. He owns the building her store is in. 3 years ago he told her there was a problem with the loan, that there was an acceleration clause she'd missed. She didn't know what that meant. She still doesn't entirely." His jaw tightened. Too old a look for too young a face. "She's been paying extra every month since then, and the number doesn't go down." Riven looked at the boy. He thought about how many times in this town a conversation like this one had happened. Someone saying these words or words like them to someone who listened and then moved on. He thought about the weight of that, accumulated over years, and what it did to people. What it did to children who grew up watching it. "Henry," he said, "does Voss know you came here?" "No," the boy said. "I was careful." "Stay that way," Riven said. "Go home. Don't come back to the stable tonight. You understand?" Henry looked at him. "Are you going to do something?" "I'm going to try," Riven said. "That's all I'll promise you." Henry nodded once, a short, serious nod, the kind that meant he understood promises that came with conditions and respected them more than promises that didn't. He left the way he'd come. Riven stood in the quiet of the stable for a moment. Shadow looked at him over the stall door with large, dark, completely unimpressed eyes. "Don't," Riven told him. The horse looked away. Elias Ward had a bottle in his desk that he hadn't opened in 6 weeks. He opened it that afternoon. Not to drink from, or not much, just to hold, to look at. To have the option present and choose, each time, to put it back down. It was something his father had taught him about willpower, which was one of the few useful things his father had taught him about anything. He sat in the sheriff's office with the bottle on the desk and his badge lying next to it, and he thought about Damon Reed's face through the stable window, and about the stranger with the quiet way of saying no, and about the 11 years he'd spent in this office and what he'd actually done with them. The office smelled like old paper and coffee, and the particular staleness of a room where a man has sat with difficult thoughts for too long. He knew every crack in the ceiling. He'd studied them enough. The problem with Calder Voss, the real problem, not the legal problem or the moral problem, but the practical problem that Elias lived with every day, was that Voss had never done anything that Elias could grab with both hands and call criminal in a way that would hold up. Every document was legitimate on its face. Every action had a legal justification. The loans were real loans, even if the terms were designed to fail. The defaults were real defaults, even if the triggers were engineered. The paper trail was immaculate. You couldn't arrest a man for being careful. Elias had tried, in his way. 3 years ago, he'd written to the territorial marshal's office. He'd described the pattern, the loans, the defaults, the progression, and asked for an examination of the bank's practices. 6 weeks later, he'd received a letter back informing him that a preliminary inquiry had found no evidence of fraud. He'd read that letter several times looking for something in it that was useful, and he'd found nothing, and eventually he'd put it in a drawer. He hadn't written another letter. He picked up the badge from the desk, turned it over in his hand. It was lighter than you'd think, for something that was supposed to mean something. He put it back down. He put the bottle back in the drawer. He stood up. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he needed to stop sitting in this office thinking about doing something and actually move his body in a direction, because the night was coming and he had a feeling about it. The same feeling he'd had in the alley that morning, the once that lived behind his sternum and wouldn't let him alone. He walked out of the office. He turned left. He walked toward the stable. Gideon answered the door of the stable with a look that said he'd been expecting someone and wasn't sure whether to be relieved it was the sheriff or more worried. "Elias," he said. "I need to talk to him," Ward said. Gideon stepped aside without a word. Riven was sitting on a hay bale, cleaning his gun with the methodical patience of a man who does it the same way every time. He looked up when Ward came in, and he didn't look surprised, which was either because he didn't surprise easily or because he'd been expecting this too. Ward stopped a few feet in. He looked at the gun, then at Riven's face, then he said, "Voss is going to set a trap for you." Riven set the gun down on his knee. "Tell me what you know." "I don't know specifics," Ward said. "I know the man. I know how he moves. He doesn't respond to confrontation directly. He redirects it. He finds something you care about, and he uses it." He paused. "You don't seem like a man with a lot to lose, which would normally make you hard to redirect. But you've been here less than 2 days, and already you've talked to Gideon, and you've talked to Damon Reed, and Voss has people in this town who pay attention to who talks to whom." Riven was very still. "He knows about Damon." "I'd assume he knows something," Ward said. "Whether he knows everything." He shook his head. "Voss plays information slowly. He collects it, and then he waits for the right moment. He probably won't move tonight." "Probably," Riven said. "Probably," Ward agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "What are you planning to do?" "Get the real ledgers out of that room above Macon's hardware," Riven said. He said it plainly, watching Ward's face. Ward's face did several things in quick succession. Surprise, then calculation, then something that was almost relief but had more complexity in it than relief usually carried. "That's not legal," he said. "The room, or what's in it?" Riven asked. Ward was quiet. "Because if what's in it is what I think it is," Riven said, "then everything built on it isn't legal either. The question is which illegal thing is bigger." Ward sat down on the other hay bale. He sat heavily, the way a man sits when he's been carrying something for a long time, and his body is making the decision to put it down before his mind gets there. He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands. "I've been sheriff here 11 years, he said. "I know. And for the last 4, I've been—" He stopped. He started again. "I kept telling myself I was managing the situation, that if I pushed back directly, Voss would bring in someone worse, that the people here were better off with me watching than with me gone, and someone Voss controlled filling this office." He pressed his thumbs against the brim of his hat. "Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just a story I told myself. I've been on both sides of that question for years." "It was probably a little of both," Riven said. Ward looked up at him. "That's a generous way to put it." "It's an honest way," Riven said. "Self-serving reasoning and genuine reasoning are usually in the room together. The question is which one you let drive." Ward was quiet. He looked at the hat in his hands. "If you get those records out," he said slowly, "what do you do with them?" "Get them out of Black Hollow," Riven said. "Territorial capital. There's a federal investigator there, a marshal named Nathan Cole. I've heard of him. He's not in Voss's pocket as far as I can tell." "As far as you can tell," Ward said. "Nothing is certain," Riven said. "But the records get out of this town, and they're out of Voss's reach. Once that happens, the game changes." Ward sat with this for a long time, long enough that Gideon had come back in and was quietly pretending to do something with a bucket in the corner. "I can't officially sanction anything that involves breaking into that room," Ward said. "I'm not asking you to," Riven said. "But if something happens tonight—" Ward paused carefully. "If there's a situation that requires a sheriff's involvement, I'm not going to be looking the other way." Riven looked at him for a moment. "That's the most useful thing you've said." Ward stood up. He put his hat back on. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was already beginning to understand the weight of it, and had decided to carry it anyway. "Be careful with Damon," he said. "I don't say that against him. I say it because Voss has used him before as a middleman in things that went wrong for other people. I don't think Damon intended it most of those times, but intent doesn't always protect you." He walked out. Gideon looked at Riven. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Riven agreed. At 6:30, the 3 of them, Riven, Damon, Gideon, moved through the alley that ran behind the eastern side of the main street. Not together. Gideon first, because an old man walking slowly through a town at dusk was invisible. Then Damon, keeping to the shadow side of the alley. Riven last, circling wide and coming at the hardware store from the side street. The light was the low amber of just before dark. In another 20 minutes, it would be dark enough. They had timed it for this. The window between enough light to see by and enough dark to move in. Damon was at the base of the eastern stairs when Riven came around the corner. The lumber stack cast a shadow long enough to cover both of them. Damon's face was tight. "Clear," he said quietly. Riven looked up the stairs. They were old wood, and old wood was loud. He tested the first step with one foot. It complained but didn't shout. He went up slowly, weight distributed, keeping to the edges where the boards were bolted more solidly. At the top, the door. Padlock. Gideon came up behind them, breathing harder than the stairs deserved. He was old, and effort was effort. And he looked at the padlock with the expression of a man taking an exam he hasn't studied for but knows he's passed before. "Give me room," he said. They gave him room. Gideon produced 2 thin pieces of metal from his coat pocket with the ease of a man who has had them there long enough that having them was ordinary. He worked in silence. Riven watched the street below through a gap in the railing. Nothing unusual. A wagon. A woman walking with a basket. Ordinary Tuesday evening town sounds. The padlock opened. Gideon exhaled. "Ben would have been faster," he muttered. They went in. The room was smaller than Riven had imagined and more organized than he'd expected. Voss was not a man who let things go to clutter. The oak cabinet stood against the left wall exactly where Damon had said, and it was solid and dark and locked tight. Gideon went to work on the first drawer. Riven stood at the window, small, overlooking the alley, and kept watch. Damon stood in the middle of the room like a man who isn't sure which direction the bad thing is coming from. "You said you helped move these ledgers once," Riven said quietly, not looking away from the window. "1.5 years ago," Damon said. "Voss trust you then?" A pause. "More than he should have." "Why'd that change?" Another pause, longer. "I told him I didn't want to handle a particular arrangement. A family. The Harlins, over on the south edge of town. They had a daughter who'd come back from back east, and she'd brought some lawyer friends with her, and they were starting to ask questions about the family's debt situation." He stopped. "Voss wanted me to discourage them from continuing to ask." Riven looked at him. "Discourage?" His word. Damon's voice was flat. "I knew what he meant. I told him I wasn't doing that. He found someone else who would. The Harlan daughter left town 2 weeks later." He looked at the floor. "I don't know exactly what was said to her. I never asked. But after that, Voss kept me at a distance." The first drawer clicked open. Gideon made a small sound. Not quite satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Inside, ledgers. Actual bound ledgers, 5 of them, in a neat row. Gideon pulled one out carefully, opened it. "Lord," he said, soft. It wasn't a prayer. It was a response to what he was seeing. Riven crossed the room and looked over his shoulder. The ledger was filled with numbers and names, a different format from a standard bank ledger, more detailed, with columns that labeled things in shorthand that took a moment to decode. Default trigger date, actual payment status, collateral acquired, value of collateral. There was a column for something abbreviated VN. Riven studied it. "What's VN?" he asked Damon. Damon came and looked. His face changed, tightened, the way a face does when it recognizes something it's been trying to forget. Voss's notation for value net, what he actually got out of the property after costs, his actual profit margin on each seizure. Riven looked at the numbers. They were not small. He took 3 ledgers. Not all 5. They couldn't carry all 5 without it being obvious, and if Voss noticed them missing immediately, the warning went up too fast. 3 was enough, if they were the right 3. He handed 2 to Damon and kept one under his arm, and they moved to go. That was when they heard it. Boots on the stairs. Not the careful, distributed weight of someone trying to be quiet. Regular footsteps, confident, unhurried. One person. Riven was at the door before Damon had fully registered what was happening. He pressed against the wall to the right of the doorframe, ledger under his left arm, right hand empty but near his hip. He looked at Damon and Gideon and made a sharp, small gesture, back, against the cabinet. They moved. The door opened. It was not one of Briggs's men. It was a man Riven hadn't seen before, younger, wearing a canvas coat. With a lantern he was in the process of lighting when he walked in. He got the lantern lit before he looked up and saw 3 people standing in a room that should have been empty, and for a moment everyone just stayed exactly where they were. The young man's eyes went to the ledgers, then to Riven's face, then back to the ledgers. Riven said quietly, "Don't." The young man had been deciding something. The "don't" settled it. He turned and went back through the door fast, boots on the stairs, and then the sound of running. "Go," Riven said. They went. The next 8 minutes were the most careful running Riven Cross had done in years. Not fast. Fast was wrong. Fast drew attention. Deliberate. Quick, but grounded. He went down the stairs first, ledger tight under his arm, and turned not back toward the main street, but further into the side street, away from where the young man had gone. He could hear Damon breathing behind him, and Gideon's slower, more effortful pace. "The stable?" Damon breathed. "No," Riven said. "Too obvious. He'll tell Briggs. Briggs comes to the stable first." "Where then?" Riven thought fast. He thought about the town's geography. The streets he'd walked that afternoon. The alleys he'd marked. The places that were too ordinary to look at twice. "Mae Tilson's store," he said. "The dry goods place on the north end." Damon looked uncertain. "You know her?" "I know of her," Riven said. "And she knows what Voss is." He didn't slow down to explain further. They moved. Through the gap between the cooperage and the empty lot. Across the back of the street, staying off the boards. On the ground where their steps were quieter. Around the north corner. Mae Tilson's dry goods store was dark at the front. She'd closed for the evening. But there was a light behind the curtain in the back. Riven knocked on the rear door. 4 times, then 2. He had no particular reason for that pattern. It just didn't sound like an official knock. A long pause. Then the sound of someone moving carefully inside. A woman's voice, low and not quite steady. "Who is it?" "My name is Riven Cross," he said. "I was at the water trough yesterday. You were in your doorway." Another pause, longer. The door opened. Mae Tilson was a small woman who occupied more space than her size accounted for. She had the look of someone who had been frightened recently enough that the fear was still visible, but underneath it was something that hadn't collapsed. The particular stubbornness of a person who has kept something going through things that should have stopped it. She looked at Riven, then at the ledgers, then at his face. "What is that?" she asked. "Evidence," Riven said. "I need somewhere to keep it safe for a few hours." Mae Tilson looked at the 3 of them standing in her back doorway. She looked at Gideon. She knew Gideon, clearly, and whatever she felt about the other 2, Gideon seemed to function as a kind of reference. Gideon gave her a small nod. She stepped back and let them in. The ledgers were real. Riven knew it before he'd read 10 pages by the quality of the information, the specific names and dates and amounts that you couldn't fabricate at that level of detail without an actual underlying reality to draw from. It was all there. Loans issued with terms that had been verbally described one way and documented another. Collateral clauses buried in language designed to be opaque. Default triggers set to fire on technicalities that had nothing to do with whether the borrower was actually paying. And the notes, Voss's own notes in a precise, cramped hand in the margins, that described the progression of each seizure as if he were narrating a chess game. Mae Tilson made coffee. She did it with the automatic competence of a woman who has run a business alone for a long time, and she set cups in front of all 3 of them without being asked, and then she stood across the table and read over Riven's shoulder, and her expression moved through several things that were painful to watch. "That's the Perkins farm," she said quietly, pointing at an entry. "Frank Perkins lost that place last spring. He said there was a mistake in the paperwork, and Voss showed him documents, and—" She stopped, swallowed. "Frank left town. I don't know where he went." "It's here," Riven said, "the real version, what actually happened." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough?" She struggled with how to finish the sentence. "To do something about him?" "If we can get these out of the territory to a federal investigator," Riven said. "Yes, this is enough." "If," Damon said. "If," Riven agreed. He looked at the ledgers spread on Mae's table, the 3 of them filled with years of careful crime, and he thought about what Ward had said, that Voss had judges, officials, influence, that the system was not neutral, that being right, even being provably right, was not the same as winning. He thought about the acceleration clause that Mae Tilson didn't fully understand, about the Harlan daughter who'd left town after someone said something to her that Damon never found out, about Henry, the 12-year-old boy with the too old look on his face. Being right was not the same as winning, but it was not nothing either. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I ride for the territorial capital. These go with me." "Voss will know before you reach the edge of town," Damon said. "Probably," Riven said. "So I leave before he knows what to do about it." "And us?" Gideon asked. He said it simply, not for himself, Riven thought, but for the others. For Mae, who was still standing with the coffee cup in her hands, looking at the ledger entry about Frank Perkins. Riven looked at him. "You stay here," he said. "You haven't done anything Voss can prove. Neither has Mae. Keep it that way." Damon was quiet. "Damon," Riven said. "I know what I did," Damon said. 3 years of it. It's in those books, probably. Some of it." "Some of it," Riven agreed. He didn't soften it. "That's a conversation for later. Right now I need to know if you're in or if you're going to make a different decision." Damon looked at the ledgers. He looked at his own hands. He made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite anything else. "I'm in," he said. Outside, somewhere down the street, a man was shouting. The words weren't clear, just the tone. The particular sound of someone who has found something wrong and is informing other people about it with the volume of a man who has authority on his side. Riven listened. He looked at the ceiling as if he could see through it to the street beyond. "They found the room," he said. Mae Tilson set down her coffee cup. She did not spill it. "Then you don't have until morning," she said. Her voice was steady. Riven looked at her and thought that she had more steel in her than most people in this town had ever seen, because fear and steel can live in the same body, and fear is just louder. "No," he said, "I don't." He began to pack the ledgers into the oilskin bag he'd taken from the stable that afternoon, without knowing exactly why he'd thought to bring it. Habit. Or something that thought ahead in him when he wasn't paying attention. Gideon stood up. "Shadow's ready," he said. "I watered him an hour ago." Riven looked at him. "You knew." "I guessed," Gideon said. "There's a difference. But the result's the same." Down the street, the shouting had acquired company. More voices, boots, the sound of organized movement. Voss's men, finding the open room, finding the gap where 3 ledgers had been. Riven could picture Briggs's face when he saw it. Could picture Briggs turning around and walking fast to wherever Voss was that evening. Could picture Calder Voss sitting somewhere, patient and cold, beginning to calculate. Riven slung the bag over his shoulder. He looked at Mae Tilson, who was standing straight, both hands flat on the table, looking back at him. "What you're keeping," she said quietly, "those are real people's lives in there, real losses." "I know," he said. "Don't lose them," she said. It wasn't dramatic. It was just the plainest possible statement of the most important thing. "I won't," he said. He went out the back door into the dark, Damon beside him, and they moved through the town that had gone wrong somewhere. Through the streets that didn't feel like streets so much as a system of pressures that Voss had arranged around himself. Toward the stable where Shadow was waiting, and the night was open and the road out was still unguarded. For now. He knew, without having to think about it, that by the time he reached the edge of Black Hollow, the situation would have changed. Voss would have heard, Briggs would be moving, and the careful, patient man in the office behind the bank would have stopped being patient and started being something else. Riven had one advantage. He knew it, and he held it. He was already moving. They made it 4 blocks before the night stopped being quiet. Riven heard it first. Not a shout, not a shot, but the specific sound of horses being pulled out of a hitching post in a hurry. 2, maybe 3 animals. The sound carried differently at night, cleaner through the dark air, and he'd learned years ago to trust what he heard before he saw it. He put his hand out and stopped Damon without looking at him. They were in the alley behind the cooperage. The stable was another 2 blocks north. Shadow was there, already watered, already, according to Gideon, ready. But 2 blocks might as well be 2 miles if the wrong men were between here and there. "How many does Briggs usually run with at night?" Riven asked, low. "Depends," Damon said. His voice had changed since they'd left Mae's store. Tighter, faster. The voice of a man whose body had remembered things his mind had tried to set down. Collection's done, he pulls back to 4. Maybe 5 if Voss called ahead. Voss called ahead, Riven said. He didn't say it as a question. The shouting they'd heard from Mae's store had been fast and organized. Not the random noise of men who'd found something unexpected, but the sound of men who'd already been told what to look for and were confirming it. Voss had either anticipated the room being accessed or had been informed quickly enough to respond before Riven had finished packing the bag. Either way, the window that had existed an hour ago was now smaller and getting smaller. We can't go straight to the stable, Riven said. Then we go around. Around takes us past the bank. Damon was quiet for a moment. There's a cut-through, he said, between the tanner's place and the old mill building. It comes out 1 block west of Gideon's, behind the fence line. Adds 4 minutes. 4 minutes is fine, Riven said. Let's go. They moved. Damon led. He knew the town better in the dark than Riven did, and there was something almost useful about the guilt that lived in him. The way it made him move with a kind of desperate precision, like a man who has decided that doing this right is the one thing he can still control. The cut-through was real. It was narrow and smelled like old hides and standing water, and halfway through it, Riven's boot went into something soft that he chose not to investigate, but they came out on the far side exactly where Damon had said, and the back fence of Gideon's stable was 20 yards ahead. Gideon was already there, on the outside of the fence, holding Shadow by the bridle. The horse was saddled. Gideon had done it in the dark, or near dark, by touch and habit, and there was something in that, an old man who'd decided this was the thing he was going to do tonight, and had done it without drama. That hit Riven somewhere specific. He didn't have time to sit with it. Briggs has men at the north end of the main street, Gideon said low. Saw them from the loft. 2 horses, standing, watching. South Road? Riven asked. Don't know, Riven thought. The South Road was the longer route to the territorial capital, 3 extra hours, rough terrain through the canyon stretch. The North Road was faster, more traveled, and currently had 2 of Briggs's horses watching it. Give me a moment, he said. He was thinking about geography, about the lay of the land west of town, which he'd scouted with his eyes that afternoon out of habit, another habit that had been useful enough times to keep. West of Black Hollow, the land opened into scrub flats for about a mile before hitting the river. The river ran north-south. If you crossed the river at the low ford, you came out on the high ground that connected to the North Road about 4 miles out of town, past wherever Briggs's men would be waiting. It was rough ground. Shadow could handle rough ground. The question was how long it would take Briggs to figure out where he'd gone and whether they had anyone positioned at the ford. They probably didn't. It wasn't a road. Most people didn't know about the ford unless they'd been working the area a long time. Riven made the decision. He took Shadow's reins from Gideon and swung up. He looked down at Damon. You need to go back, he said. Not to your place. They'll look there. Go to Ward, tell him what we found, what's in those ledgers. He needs to know before Voss gets to him with his version. Damon looked up at him. In the dark, his face was hard to read. And if Ward's already turned, then you know, Riven said, and you find somewhere to be that isn't here. That's not a great plan. No, Riven agreed, but it's what we have. Damon was quiet. Then he nodded. The same kind of short, honest nod that Henry had given him that afternoon. The nod that meant, I understand this might not work, and I'm doing it anyway. Riven looked at Gideon. The old man looked back at him. He had the expression of someone who has watched a lot of things begin and knows what the beginning of something hard looks like. Go, he said. Riven went. Shadow moved well in the dark. He always had. It was one of the things about the horse that Riven had come to depend on in the way you come to depend on qualities in a creature that has chosen, for its own reasons, to go where you go. Shadow didn't spook at shadows. He picked his footing carefully, and when the ground changed under him, he slowed to account for it instead of fighting it. In terrain like the scrub flats west of Black Hollow, that quality was worth more than speed. Riven rode with the oilskin bag against his chest, one arm across it, the other hand on the reins. The ledgers were dry and intact. He could feel their weight, not just the physical weight, which was considerable, but the other kind. Mae Tilson's voice. Those are real people's lives in there. He rode for 20 minutes through the scrub before he heard the first pursuit. It was behind him and south, 2 horses by the sound, moving fast on harder ground than he was. They'd come from the south road, not the north, which meant either someone had seen him go west or Briggs had been thorough enough to set men at multiple points. The sound was distant enough that he wasn't in immediate trouble, but distant didn't mean anything if the ground ahead slowed him down. He adjusted his angle slightly north, steering Shadow toward where he knew the river was by the particular smell of the air, cooler, softer, carrying the mineral scent of moving water. Shadow's ears tracked it before Riven could see anything. The ford, when he found it, was lower than he'd expected. Spring runoff must have passed recently. The water level was still up, the current moving with intention. Not dangerous for a good horse, but not nothing either. He pulled Shadow to a stop at the edge and let the horse assess it. Shadow put 1 foot in, tested the bottom, pulled it back. Did it again, went in. The water came up to Shadow's belly at the deepest point, cold enough that Riven could feel it through his boots and his legs. The current pushed sideways and Shadow leaned into it, muscles working, crossing at an angle that was slower but more stable. Riven kept his weight centered and didn't rush him. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had slowed. He heard voices, 2 men, debating something. They'd found the ford and were deciding whether to cross. That was time. Not much, but some. Shadow came out on the far bank, shook himself. A full-body shudder that nearly unseated Riven, and then found his footing on the slope and climbed. Back in Black Hollow, Calder Voss was not calm. He was controlled. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. He sat in his office behind the bank with the lamp turned up, and Harlan Briggs standing in front of his desk, and he was controlled in the way a fire is controlled when it's behind glass. All the heat was present, none of it was loose. 3 ledgers, he said. Yes, Briggs said. The ones from the middle drawer. I can check which ones are. The middle drawer held the records from the last 4 years, Voss said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the part that was worse than shouting. The complete documentation of every transaction, every margin note, He stopped. Composed himself in the way a man composes himself when composure is a discipline he has practiced. Who accessed the room? We think it was Reed, Briggs said, and the stranger, and probably Pike. 3 men. Voss looked at the desk, and one of them is already out of town with the evidence. We have men on the north. He didn't go north, Voss said. He's smarter than the north road. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to Briggs, looking at the dark street. Who else knows? In town? In town, outside my organization. Who has he talked to? Briggs hesitated. Ward, he said. I think Ward went to the stable this afternoon. Voss was very still. You think? I didn't see it myself. One of my... Ward, Voss said again, more quietly. He turned from the window. His face had done something that Briggs had only seen a few times in 4 years of working for the man. It had become simpler, stripped down to something that was not reasoning, but was the thing that reasoning served. Bring me Reed, he said. Tonight. Don't hurt him yet. I need to talk to him first. Briggs blinked. You think Reed knows where Cross is going? I think Reed knows enough to be useful, Voss said. And I think when I put the right kind of pressure on him, he'll understand that the evidence Cross is carrying also contains records of things Reed did. 3 years of things. His voice was even, almost gentle. He may decide his interests are better served on our side of this. Briggs nodded and moved to go. Harlan, Voss said. Briggs stopped. Don't involve Ward yet, Voss said. Leave him alone tonight. He paused. Let him think he has a choice. It will make the conversation easier when it's time to have it. Elias Ward was not thinking about choices. He was thinking about a letter. He sat at his desk, the same bottle back in the drawer, unopened this time, and he was drafting a letter to Marshal Nathan Cole at the territorial capital. He'd started it 3 times. The first 2 had come out wrong, too careful, too lawyerly, too much like a man covering himself rather than a man saying what he needed to say. The 3rd version was simpler. He was trying to write the thing plainly. He wrote, I am the sheriff of Black Hollow, and I have reason to believe that documentary evidence of systematic fraud is currently in transit toward your office. The man carrying it is named Riven Cross. He should be given full hearing. He read it back. It wasn't elegant, but it was true. and it was short enough that it didn't bury the important parts in words. He was folding it when Damon Reed knocked on the office door. Ward opened the door and looked at Damon for a moment, then stepped back to let him in. Damon looked like a man who had been running, not physically, but in some internal way. Like his thoughts had been moving fast for hours, and he hadn't been able to keep up with all of them. "You already know," Damon said, looking at the letter in Ward's hand. "I'm getting there," Ward said. Damon told him what had been in the ledgers. Not the specifics, he hadn't read them closely enough for specifics, but the structure. The names he'd recognized, the margin notes in Voss's hand. Ward listened without interrupting, which was harder than it should have been because several of the names Damon mentioned were names Ward had known. People he'd talked to. People who'd come to his office over the years, tentative, confused about their situations, and Ward had sent them to the bank to speak with Voss because Voss had told him, several times in several ways, that the debt matters were complicated and best handled through proper financial channels. He sat with that for a while after Damon stopped talking. "How many, do you think?" Ward said. Not to Damon particularly, just to the room. "In those 3 ledgers?" Damon said. "I didn't count, but I saw the pages. Dozens. Maybe more over the full 4 years. Ward nodded slowly. He thought about Voss's patience, about how you built something like this, not in a day, not in a month, but over years, adding one piece at a time, each piece looking like a reasonable transaction until you stepped back far enough to see what the pieces formed. "He's going to come for you tonight," Ward said. Damon's jaw tightened. "I know. Not to hurt you. He'll want to talk first." Ward looked at him. "He'll tell you that your name is in those ledgers, that if Cross gets them to the marshal, you're implicated too, that you'd be better served." "I know what he'll tell me," Damon said. "I know how he operates. I worked for him for 3 years. "Then you know it'll be convincing," Ward said. A pause. Damon looked at the wall. He looked at his hands. He looked like a man having a conversation with himself that was happening too fast and covering too much ground. "Is he right?" he asked. "About my name being in those ledgers?" Ward considered the answer carefully. "Probably," he said. "Some version of it. But there's a difference between being documented as someone who carried out Voss's instructions and being the man who designed the system and profited from it." He paused. "That distinction matters, if you're on the right side when this ends." "If," Damon said. "If," Ward agreed. Damon stood up. He'd made his calculation. Ward could see it in the way his body resettled, the particular set of a man who's committed to a direction and is trying not to second-guess it. "What do I do?" "Stay out of reach tonight," Ward said. "Not your place, not Gideon's. Is there somewhere in this town you can disappear for 12 hours? Damon thought. "Mae Tilson might—" "Don't involve Mae more than she already is," Ward said quickly. He thought for a moment. "The old Kettrick place, south edge of town. Nobody's lived there in 2 years. Voss doesn't have a lien on it because the family that owned it paid everything off before they left. Key's under the 3rd stone left of the porch step." He looked at Damon. "I'm not going to ask how I know that." Damon almost smiled. "Almost." "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Ward said. "Cross still has to get through." Riven was 40 minutes north of the ford when the pain started. He hadn't noticed it properly at first. Too much else to track. The terrain, the sounds behind him, the weight of the bag. But somewhere between the river and the high ground, he'd taken a branch across the left forearm at speed, riding too close to a stand of scrub oak in the dark, and the skin had opened up in a way that was more than a scratch, but less than serious. His sleeve was wet. He'd noted it and filed it and kept moving. Now, on the cleaner stretch of road that connected to the north route, the arm was insisting on his attention. He pulled Shadow to a brief stop, checked behind him. Nothing audible, nothing visible. And unwrapped his bandana from his neck and tied it around the forearm. Not a good job, a functional job. Shadow turned his head and looked at him. "I know," Riven said. He pressed his knee and Shadow moved on. The night had the feel of being past its worst point. The blackest hours between midnight and dawn, when the world bottoms out and then begins, imperceptibly, to prepare for something other than dark. Riven knew this feeling from the road. He'd had too many nights that were mostly riding and mostly alone, and he'd made a kind of peace with that particular quality of late night, that wasn't sleep and wasn't waking, but was a third thing that the road produced if you were out in it long enough. He thought about Mae Tilson's face, about the ledger entry she'd pointed to, Frank Perkins, the farm, gone. He thought about how she'd said it. He said there was a mistake in the paperwork. The particular cruelty of the word mistake. The way Voss had built a system where the victim's confusion was part of the mechanism, where people blamed themselves for not understanding something that had been designed specifically to be misunderstood. He thought about Gideon, watering Shadow in the dark before he'd been asked. He rode. By the time Briggs got to Damon Reed's lodging and found it empty, Voss had already moved past the immediate anger and into the longer, colder calculation. He sat in the bank office and worked through the possible outcomes with the same systematic patience he applied to everything. The ledgers were in transit. Cross was ahead of his men. Reed had gone to ground somewhere, probably with Ward's help, which meant Ward had made his choice faster than expected. That was the variable Voss hadn't fully accounted for. He'd expected Ward to take longer. He'd expected the sheriff's particular brand of paralysis to hold through at least another day, giving Voss time to present him with a version of events before the opposing version arrived. But Ward had not been paralyzed tonight. Ward had moved. Voss sat with this. He was not a man who wasted energy being angry at himself for misjudgments. He noted them, updated his model, and continued. The question was, what could still be stopped? Cross reaching the territorial capital with 3 ledgers and delivering them to Nathan Cole. That was the outcome Voss needed to prevent. If Cole received the ledgers intact, with a full accounting from Cross, the investigation opened. And if the investigation opened thoroughly, it didn't end at Black Hollow. Voss had been careful, but no one was careful enough for a federal investigation that knew exactly where to look. He needed to intercept Cross before the capital. Or he needed to ensure that what Cross delivered was incomplete, disputed, contextualized, easy to dismiss. He picked up his pen. He began to write. He had a judge in the next county who owed him something significant. He had a man at the land office who had been on his payroll for 2 years. And he had something else. Something he hadn't used yet because he hadn't needed to, but which had always been there as a final option. He had the deed to the land that Cross's horse had been claimed against. The claim was fraudulent, as Cross had correctly identified, but the document existed. And a fraudulent document, presented confidently to the right official, looked identical to a real one until someone spent time investigating it. And time was the thing Voss needed most. He finished writing. He folded the letter, sealed it, and called for a writer. Dawn found Riven Cross on the high ridge above the canyon stretch, 8 miles from the territorial capital, when the ambush that wasn't quite an ambush happened. It was a single man. Not Briggs. Someone Riven didn't recognize, heavy-set, with a horse that had been ridden hard through the night. He was positioned at the narrow point where the ridge road pinched between 2 rock faces, and he had a rifle, but he was holding it wrong. Not aimed, just present, like a suggestion of violence rather than a commitment to it. Riven pulled Shadow to a stop 30 yards out. He and the man looked at each other. "You're Cross," the man said. "And you're blocking a public road," Riven said. "Voss wants the bag," the man said. "He says you give over the bag and there's no more trouble. You ride on, nothing follows you." Riven looked at him, at the way he was holding the rifle, at the single horse, which meant this man had come alone, which meant either Voss was very confident or very disorganized, and Voss was not disorganized. "There's someone else," Riven said. The man blinked. "What?" "You're the distraction," Riven said. "Where's the other one?" The man's face did something involuntary, a small contraction around the eyes that confirmed it before he could stop it. He wasn't a good liar. He was probably a decent enough enforcer under normal circumstances, but he hadn't been prepared for someone to see through the arrangement this fast. Riven heard the second man a half-second too late. He'd come around the rocks on the right side, lower than the ridge road, scrambling up with a revolver already drawn, already moving. He was close. 20 feet, maybe less. Riven did not reach for his gun. He kicked Shadow hard to the left, directly toward the rock face, which was the last thing either man expected because it was also the last thing that made any conventional sense. Shadow, to his everlasting credit, went without hesitation, hooves scrabbling on the loose stone, body driving into the narrow space between the rock and the road's edge. The second man's shot went wide. High, by the sound of it, He'd aimed for where Riven had been a quarter second earlier. The first man on the road swung the rifle around and Riven was already past him, Shadow having cleared the narrow point in a controlled lunge that left both men behind and scrambling. He didn't stop. He pressed Shadow forward, down the far side of the ridge, onto the easier ground that led to the Capitol Road. His heart was going hard. Not fast exactly, but with emphasis, each beat announcing itself. He checked the bag. Intact. The arm was still bleeding, slower now, the bandana darkly wet. Behind him, he heard one more shot, far behind. And then nothing. He rode. What? He reached the territorial capital in the mid-morning. It was larger than Black Hollow by a factor that made Black Hollow feel, in retrospect, like something Voss could hold in one hand. There were people on the streets who moved with the energy of people who hadn't spent years being slowly compressed. The contrast hit Riven in a way he hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something that felt like seeing color after a long time in gray. He found the federal marshal's office on the 2nd Street north of the main square. It was a real building, stone foundation, solid door, a flag that had weathered enough seasons to look earned rather than decorative. He tied Shadow at the post outside and stood for a moment, letting the horse breathe. He looked at the door. The arm needed tending. He was tired in a specific way that was past normal tired, the kind of tired that settles into the joints and the back of the eyes that a night's sleep would fix, but that made the world look slightly unreal in the meantime. He was aware of both of these things and set them aside. He went in. The office was occupied by 2 men. One was young, a deputy, who looked up from a desk with the alertness of someone who spent most of his time not being needed and was ready for an exception. The other man was older, mid-50s, with a face that had been outdoors for most of them, and eyes that were doing the quick, thorough inventory of Riven that experienced men did when a stranger walked in looking like Riven currently looked. "Marshal Cole?" Riven said. The older man stood up from his chair. "That's me." He looked at the bag, at the arm, at Riven's face. He said, "Sit down." "I'd rather stand," Riven said. "I've been sitting on a horse." "Fair enough." Cole came around the desk. I was a compact man, not big, who moved with the specific economy of someone who had learned to save his energy for when it mattered. "You want to tell me who you are and what you're carrying?" "Riven Cross," Riven said, "and I'm carrying 3 ledgers from Calder Voss's private records room in a town called Black Hollow. They document 4 years of systematic fraud, false debt instruments, engineered defaults, seizure of property from people who had no idea what the documents they'd signed actually said." He set the bag on Cole's desk. "There may also be connections to officials in this territory who've been protecting him." Cole looked at the bag. He looked at Riven. He said, in a tone that was neither skeptical nor credulous, but something more precise than either, the tone of a man who has heard a lot of things and knows the difference between the ones that need immediate attention and the ones that can wait. "How did you get those?" "I broke into the room they were stored in," Riven said. Cole looked at him. "I know how that sounds," Riven said. "It sounds honest," Cole said. He pulled the bag toward him and opened it. He lifted out the first ledger carefully, the way you handle something you suspect is important before you've confirmed it. He opened to a page in the middle and read for a moment. His face didn't change much. The faces of men in his line didn't usually, but something in his posture shifted, a slight increase in stillness. The way a man goes still when he's stopped processing and started understanding. "How many people in Black Hollow know about this?" he asked. "The sheriff, Elias Ward, an old man named Gideon Pike, a former Voss employee named Damon Reed, a woman named Mae Tilson, and probably Voss himself by now, plus however many men he sent after me." Riven paused. "One of them made it to the Ridge Road before me. Maybe 2. Cole looked up from the ledger. "You're hurt." "It's not serious. My deputy's got supplies," Cole said, not making it an offer. "While I keep reading." He said it with the particular authority of a man who doesn't phrase things as orders because he doesn't need to. He called the deputy over, who led Riven to a side chair and began unwrapping the bandana with the careful hands of someone who'd done this before for different reasons. Cole read. He turned pages slowly, going back to cross-reference entries, making small notations in a leather-covered notebook he'd produced from his desk drawer. The office was quiet except for the sounds of the street outside, and the deputy's work and the occasional turn of a page. Riven sat and let the arm be cleaned and wrapped properly. He watched Cole's face. He was trying to read what was there. Not suspicion, not dismissal, but something more complex. The expression of a man building a picture in his head and not entirely liking what it was showing him. After 20 minutes, Cole looked up. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what you've brought me is significant. But it's also the kind of evidence that Voss is going to challenge immediately. He's going to say it was obtained illegally." "It was," Riven said. "And he's going to say the documentation is incomplete, taken out of context, selectively presented." Cole tapped the ledger. "He may also have made copies that tell a different story. Men like this often do." "I know," Riven said. "That's why there are two more things." Cole waited. "The ledgers themselves are only part of it," Riven said. "The people in Black Hollow, the ones who lost their land, their businesses. Voss made them afraid to talk. But afraid people talk when they see something changing, when they believe it's actually going to matter." He paused. "You send investigators to Black Hollow with the right kind of authority, the testimony will be there. And Ward, the sheriff, he'll cooperate. He's been carrying this for 4 years, and he's ready to put it down." Cole looked at him for a long moment. He seemed to be conducting some internal assessment, weighing Riven against what he'd read, against what he knew about towns like Black Hollow and men like Voss, against whatever his own experience told him about the kind of man who rides through a night with a bleeding arm to deliver evidence he broke the law to obtain. "The second thing," Cole said. Riven reached into his coat. He produced a single folded sheet of paper, not from the ledgers, not from Voss's records, his own. A list of names, dates, and property descriptions that he'd written by hand the previous day, before any of this started, based on what Gideon and Damon and Mae had told him. The secondary testimony, the pattern visible from the outside. The kind of thing that corroborated documents without being the documents. Cole took it, read it, looked at Riven. "You prepared this yesterday," he said. "Before I went into the room," Riven said, "because I knew there was a chance I wouldn't make it out with the ledgers, and I wanted there to be something from a different source." Cole was quiet for a moment. He folded the paper and placed it inside the first ledger. He closed the ledger and set his hand flat on the cover. "Voss is going to fight this," he said. "He has resources. He has connections." "I know," Riven said. "This is going to take time." "I know that too." "And in the meantime," Riven said, "there are people in Black Hollow who are waiting to see if it mattered. If I'm sitting here telling you it's going to take time, I need to go back and tell them that. Because people who've been waiting that long need to know the wait is for something real." Cole looked at him steadily. "You're going back." "After I sleep," Riven said, "and eat something, and see to my horse." Cole's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the version of it that lives in the eyes of a man who doesn't smile easily and respects that in others. "My deputy will find you a room," he said, "and a meal." He looked down at the ledger again. "I'll start making arrangements tonight." Riven stood up. His body registered every hour of the night in specific locations. The lower back, the left arm, the backs of his knees. He stood anyway, because there was still the process of getting from this chair to wherever the deputy was taking him, and that process required being vertical. "Mr. Cross," Cole said. Riven looked back. "What you brought me tonight?" Cole paused. He was choosing words with the care of a man who knows the weight of them. "This didn't have to be your problem." Riven thought about that for a moment. He thought about a water trough, and a Tuesday morning, and a man who held a paper up but wouldn't let him read it. He thought about a 61-year-old woman's hands shaking over a debt she'd never borrowed. "It wasn't my problem," he said. "It became my problem because I didn't leave when I should have." He paused. "I'm not sure that's something I regret." He followed the deputy out. Behind him, Marshal Nathan Cole opened the second ledger and began to read. And outside the window of the federal marshal's office, the morning was fully arrived now, and the streets of the territorial capital moved with the ordinary motion of people who didn't know that 40 miles west, in a town that had spent years forgetting how to breathe, something had finally shifted. Not finished, not safe, not clean, but shifted. And sometimes that was where everything began. He slept for 6 hours and woke up feeling like someone had beaten him with the road itself. The room the deputy had found him was small and smelled like old plaster, and the particular mustiness of a building that had been standing longer than anyone currently alive remembered. The bed was narrow and the pillow was flat, and Riven had slept on it like a dead man. When he opened his eyes, the light coming through the single window was the pale yellow of mid-morning, and his left arm had stiffened overnight into something that required deliberate management before it would do what he told it. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just letting his body register where it was and what it had done, and begin the process of deciding it could continue. He thought about Black Hollow, about Gideon in the dark, holding Shadow's bridle, having already done the thing that needed doing, about Ward sitting in his office with a letter and a decision that had been a long time coming, about Damon Reed in the cut-through alley, moving with the desperate precision of a man running towards something instead of away from it for the first time in years. He thought about whether they were all right. He got up, he dressed. He went to find his horse. Shadow was in better shape than he was. The livery stable attached to the marshal's office building had good hay and clean water, and the horse had made thorough use of both. He lifted his head when Riven came in and regarded him with the large-eyed patience of an animal that had decided its part of last night's business was done and was ready to hear what came next. Not yet, Riven told him. He checked Shadow's hooves, one stone bruise developing on the left front from the rocky ford crossing, not serious but worth watching. He ran his hands along the horse's legs, checked the spots where the saddle sat, made note of nothing critical. Shadow stood for all of it with practiced tolerance. The deputy, his name was Chet, young enough that the badge still looked slightly borrowed, appeared at the stable door with coffee and a plate of food that Riven consumed standing up without tasting much of it. Chet had the look of someone who had questions he was deciding whether to ask. The marshal was up all night, Chet said. Riven looked at him. Reading, Chet clarified. All 3 ledgers. He made notes. A lot of notes. A pause. I've worked for him 4 years. I've never seen him make that many notes. Riven said nothing and finished the coffee. He wants to see you before you go anywhere, Chet said. I figured, Riven said. Cole looked like a man who had slept 2 hours and didn't resent it. There was a quality to him in the morning that was different from the previous night. Not harder exactly, but more organized. Like the information he'd absorbed had sorted itself into a structure he knew how to work with. He had the ledgers open on his desk, along with a map of the territory, and he'd made marks on it with a pencil. Small circles, connected by lines, in a pattern that Riven looked at for a moment before he understood what he was seeing. These aren't the only towns, Cole said without preamble. Damon Reed told me that, Riven said. 3 other towns he knew of. 4, Cole said. He tapped one of the circles. Harwick, Dry Creek, Millfield, and a settlement called Austin's Crossing that's barely on the maps. The margin notations in the 3rd ledger reference property transfers in all of them. Different names on the paperwork, different local figures involved, but the same structure. He looked up. Voss has been building this for longer than 4 years. The ledgers cover 4 years because that's when he started keeping this particular set of records. But the pattern in the notation suggests earlier work that's documented somewhere else. Riven stood at the desk and looked at the map, at the circles, at the lines between them. He thought about what Damon had said. It's not just a man stealing from a town, it's a system, and felt the full weight of that settle in a way it hadn't entirely before. The judges, Riven said, the officials, are they in the ledgers? Not by name, Cole said, by notation. Voss is careful about that, but the notations are consistent enough that cross-referencing them with public records of rulings and decisions in those areas, he paused. It's going to take work. It's going to take more than me. He leaned back in his chair. I sent a wire this morning to the federal district office. I've requested a formal investigative team. It will take several days for them to arrive. Several days, Riven said. In the meantime, Cole said, Voss is not sitting still. Riven waited. Cole picked up a piece of paper from the corner of his desk. This came in by wire 2 hours ago from a Judge Clarence Merritt, county seat 1 district over. He's issued a warrant for the recovery of what he's calling stolen financial documents, property of the Black Hollow Territorial Bank. Cole set the paper down. The warrant names you. Riven looked at the warrant. He read it. It was well written, the language precise, the legal framing technically coherent, the justification built on the same foundational lie Harlan Briggs had been trying that first morning at the water trough. The documents were bank property, their removal was theft, the thief was Riven Cross. Merritt, Riven said. Is he one of Voss's judges? I don't know yet, Cole said. He may be genuinely deceived by Voss's version rather than compromised. It doesn't matter much in practical terms. The warrant is real either way. Which means I can't go back to Black Hollow, Riven said. Not a question. He was working it out as he said it. Not without risking arrest, Cole said. And if you're arrested, the legal process around the ledgers gets complicated. Voss's lawyers argue that evidence obtained by an individual under an active warrant is tainted. It doesn't make the ledgers inadmissible in a federal investigation, but it creates noise, and noise is what Voss needs. It slows everything down. Riven was quiet. He stood at the desk and looked at the map and thought about the specific texture of being outplayed. Not because you made a mistake, but because the other person was also smart and had more pieces on the board. What do you need from me? He said. Cole looked at him with something that was close to appreciation. He'd probably expected more resistance to the situation, more frustration maybe, or the kind of argument that men made when they felt their options being reduced. Riven wasn't interested in arguing with the shape of things, only in working with it. I need you here, Cole said, at least for now. As a witness, as the man who can explain the context of what's in those ledgers to my investigators when they arrive. And I need you to stay here in a way that doesn't give Merritt's warrant an easy target. He paused. I have a narrow legal argument that the warrant doesn't extend to federal jurisdiction in this office. It's narrow, but it holds long enough to be useful. And Black Hollow? Riven said. I'm sending Chet, Cole said. Today. He'll carry a letter from me to Ward with enough federal authority in it to give Ward something to stand behind. And he'll make sure Reed is still in one piece and that Voss hasn't found a way to, Cole chose his words, rearrange the witness situation. Riven didn't like it. He didn't like the part where other people were in Black Hollow dealing with the consequences of something he'd started while he sat in a building 40 miles away, waiting for investigators to arrive from a district office. He didn't like the part where Gideon was an old man in a town where Voss was now moving without patience. He didn't like any of it. All right, he said. Chet left within the hour, riding a fresh horse, with Cole's letter in his coat and the particular expression of a young deputy who has been given a real assignment for the first time and is trying not to look like he knows it. Riven watched him go from the doorway of the marshal's office and then turned back inside and found a chair and began the particular work of waiting, which was harder than riding and always had been. Cole gave him the second ledger to read through fully, not for content, but for Riven's annotations. Cross-referencing what was written with what he'd been told by Gideon and Damon and Mae, marking passages that connected to specific individuals whose testimony would corroborate them. It was methodical work, the kind that required your hands to be moving but left your head partially free, and Riven's head used the freedom to keep running back to Black Hollow despite his best efforts. He thought about Ward and the letter the sheriff had been writing when Damon arrived, about what it cost a man to admit, in writing, that he'd been part of a failure for 4 years by not acting. Ward hadn't been complicit, not in the way Damon had been, but paralysis had its own accountability, and Ward knew it, and the knowing was visible in every interaction Riven had had with him. He thought about Damon Reed in the Kettrick place on the south edge of town, alone in an empty house with his 3 years of choices. He thought about the young man who'd walked into the room above Macon's hardware with a lantern, and the moment they'd all just stayed exactly where they were, and how close it had come to going differently. He kept annotating. He kept waiting. In Black Hollow, Calder Voss was working through the problem with characteristic patience, and characteristic patience was wearing thin. He didn't show it to anyone. He sat in his office, and he read the wire response from Judge Merritt confirming the warrant, and he nodded once as if the node were a period at the end of a sentence, and then he folded the wire and placed it in the left drawer of his desk, and he thought about what came next. Cross was at the marshal's office. That was the information that had come back from the men he'd sent. They'd tracked Cross to the Capitol, confirmed the delivery, returned with the news that the ledgers were in Cole's possession. It was the worst outcome, but it wasn't the final outcome. Voss had been in worse positions than this, and he had learned something from all of them, which was that the first version of any crisis was never the last version, and the man who responded to the first version as if it were final was always the one who lost. The question was momentum. Cole would move, but Cole needed authority, and authority moved in official channels, and official channels had friction. Every day of friction was a day Voss could use. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a letter to his lawyer in the capital, a man named Prentice, who was expensive and thorough and who had an instinct for procedural complexity that Voss found genuinely admirable. He wrote carefully, laying out the situation without admitting anything that could be read as admission. He framed the ledgers as proprietary bank documents obtained through burglary. He framed Cross as a transient with unknown motives. He framed the entire situation as a misappropriation of private financial records by a man with a warrant already out for his arrest. And he asked Prentice to file for injunctive relief preventing the federal office from using illegally obtained materials. It probably wouldn't hold, Voss knew that. But it wouldn't need to hold forever. It just needed to hold long enough for Prentice to find the specific procedural thread that might unravel something. And Prentice was very good at finding threads. He sealed the letter. He called for a writer. Then he turned to the other problem. Ward. Ward had made his choice, and Voss had underestimated how fast he'd make it. He needed to understand what Ward had actually done. What was in the letter the sheriff had been writing, who he'd communicated with, what he'd told Damon Reed. He needed to understand the full shape of what was now moving against him before he could know where to apply counterpressure. He called Briggs in. "I want to talk to Ward," he said. Briggs looked uncertain. "You want me to bring him here?" "No," Voss said. "I'll go to him." He stood up. "Bring 2 men. Don't make it look like 2 men." Elias Ward was at his desk when Voss walked into the sheriff's office. He'd been expecting something. Not this exactly. Not Voss himself. Not this soon. But something. The morning had had the quality of a morning after, where everything that was going to happen next was already in motion, and you were simply waiting to find out what form it took. Voss came in alone, which was not actually alone. Ward could see Briggs and one other man positioning themselves on the street outside, visible through the window, precisely visible enough to be a message without being a threat he could formally object to. Voss closed the door behind him and took the chair across from Ward's desk without being invited, and set his hat on his knee with the comfortable ease of a man visiting someone he considers an ally. "Elias," he said. "Calder," Ward said. They'd been on first-name terms for 4 years. It had always felt to Ward like a slow-acting trap, the familiarity making each capitulation easier to rationalize, each compromise feel like something between reasonable men rather than something being extracted. He felt the weight of it now more clearly than he ever had, looking at the man across his desk. "This has gotten complicated," Voss said. He said it like they were 2 men sharing a problem, which they were not. "I imagine you've had a difficult night." "Some," Ward said. "I wanted to talk with you before this progresses further," Voss said, "because I think there's still a version of this that works for everyone. Cole will receive what Cross delivered. There'll be an inquiry. These things happen. But an inquiry needs to establish facts, and facts need sources. And the sources in this case," he paused, "a transient who broke into a private facility. A former employee with 3 years of his own questionable decisions documented in those same ledgers. An old stable hand." He opened his hand slightly, a gesture of reasoned consideration. "The testimony of a sitting sheriff, on the other hand, that has weight." Ward looked at him. "I'm not asking you to lie," Voss said. "I would never ask that. I'm asking you to be accurate, to be precise, to give the federal investigators the full context of who brought them this information and under what circumstances." He paused. That context, presented properly, raises legitimate questions about reliability. Ward was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the desk between them. He looked at the badge lying on it, which he'd taken off that morning without knowing exactly why and hadn't put back on yet. "You know what's in those ledgers," Ward said. "Not an accusation, just a statement." "I know what my bank's records contain," Voss said carefully. "Frank Perkins," Ward said. "Mae Tilson, the Kettrick family, the people on Dry Creek and Millfield and—" He stopped. He looked at Voss. "You've been doing this for how long before Black Hollow?" Something moved in Voss's expression. Very slight, a recalibration. He hadn't expected Ward to know about the other towns. The bank's operations in other areas are— Calder, Ward said. Stop. He said it quietly, and the quiet of it was the same quality as the quiet in Riven Cross's voice when he told Harlan Briggs no at the water trough. Not performance, just finality. I'm not going to testify against the evidence. I'm not going to give you context that muddies the investigation. I wrote a letter to Cole last night, and I'm going to write a fuller one today. And when his investigators come to Black Hollow, I'm going to cooperate with them completely. Voss was still. He looked at Ward with an expression that had lost the pretense of shared problem. What was underneath it was not quite what Ward had expected. Not rage, not calculation, but something that was almost recognition. Like Ward had said something Voss had known was coming and had been trying to delay. You understand what this costs you, Voss said. Some of it, Ward said. I was sheriff here while this was happening. I knew something was wrong and I didn't do enough about it soon enough. That's going to be part of the record, and it should be. He reached out and picked up the badge from the desk. He held it for a moment and then pinned it back on. But doing nothing more isn't going to make that better. It's just going to make it worse. Voss stood up. He put his hat on. He looked at Ward with the flat, assessing look of a man who has moved all his pieces in a particular direction and is now rerouting. You're making a mistake, he said. You're the second person who's told me that in 2 days, Ward said. The first one was wrong. Voss left. The door closed. Through the window, Ward watched him say something to Briggs on the street, and the way Briggs's face responded, tight, readying, told Ward that whatever had just been a conversation was now going to be something else. He stood up from the desk. He began to think about the next 12 hours in very practical terms. What he controlled, what he didn't, where the people who needed protecting were, and what Voss would do now that Ward had closed the door on the version of events Voss had needed. Chet arrived in Black Hollow in the early afternoon. He came in quiet, just a rider on a road, no federal insignia visible, nothing that announced itself. And he went directly to the sheriff's office because Cole had told him Ward was the axis around which everything in Black Hollow was currently turning, and Cole's assessments were reliable. Ward read Cole's letter standing up, which took about 2 minutes. Then he read it again sitting down, which took longer because he was reading it differently the second time. Not for information, but for what it meant. What it meant was that Cole was moving, that the investigation was real and had federal weight behind it, that it would take days, not hours, and that those days needed to be survived without the situation in Black Hollow deteriorating past the point where testimony was possible. How's Cross? Ward asked. Alive, Chet said. Arm got cut up somewhere on the ride. He's annotating the ledgers for the investigators. He paused. He asked about everyone here. What did you tell him? That I didn't know yet, Chet said. Because I didn't. Ward nodded. He looked at the letter again. Voss was here this morning, he said. He left an hour ago. He's going to move now, quickly, the way he moves when patience runs out. I need to know where Reed is and make sure he stays. Already on the Kettrick place, Chet said. Cole told me. Ward looked at him. Cole told you to go there before you came here? Cole told me to check there first and then come here, Chet said, with the careful precision of a young man quoting instructions exactly. I checked. Reed is there. He's all right. He asked about Cross, too. What did you tell him? Same thing, Chet said. That I didn't know yet. Ward stood up. He moved to the window and looked at the street. Ordinary afternoon. People moving. A wagon. A dog that had been sleeping in the same patch of sun in front of the cooper's shop every afternoon for as long as Ward could remember. The surface of Black Hollow, undisturbed. Voss is going to try to create a crisis before Cole's people arrive, Ward said. Something that changes the situation on the ground. I don't know what form it takes, but he's not going to just wait. What do we do? Chet asked. Ward thought. He was thinking about resources, what he had, what he didn't. He had himself, a deputy of his own who was competent but young, and now a federal deputy whose authority was real, but whose presence was one person in a town where Voss had been building infrastructure for years. We stay visible, Ward said. We don't give him a quiet corner to operate in. Every person in this town who's at risk, Mae Tilson, Gideon Pike, anyone who talked to Cross, they need to know we're watching. He paused. And Voss needs to know we're watching. That might push him to move faster, Chet said. Yes, Ward agreed. But moving fast makes mistakes, and Voss's whole system runs on not making mistakes. He looked at the young deputy. We make him feel rushed. We see what happens. What happened was Prentice. The lawyer arrived in Black Hollow the next morning on a hired coach, which was the kind of arrival that announced itself. And he went directly to the bank where Voss was waiting. Riven heard about it secondhand later from the account Ward sent by wire. A detailed, methodical account that was recognizably Ward's voice, saying more than he'd once allowed himself to say. Prentice had filed the injunctive motion in the capital that same afternoon, which Riven learned about from Cole directly, when the marshal came into the room where Riven had been working and set a piece of paper on the desk with the expression of a man who is not surprised but is not pleased. Temporary injunction, Cole said, preventing my office from using the ledgers as primary evidence in any proceedings until the question of their legal provenance is adjudicated. Riven read the motion. It was good work, genuinely good, in the way that a skilled argument was good even when you disagreed with everything it was saying. Prentice had constructed a plausible legal narrative around illegal search and seizure, around chain of custody, around the warrant Merritt had issued. It didn't make the ledgers disappear, but it put them behind glass until a judge decided otherwise, and that decision was, at minimum, weeks away. The investigators who are coming, Riven said. Does this stop them? It complicates them, Cole said. They can investigate. They can gather testimony. They cannot use the ledgers as the primary evidentiary basis for any arrest or formal charge until the injunction is resolved. He sat down. Voss is buying time. Riven set the motion down. He looked at the map on Cole's wall with its penciled circles and connecting lines. I thought about the shape of the problem, about the fact that the ledgers were real and the crimes were documented, and there were real people in 4 towns whose real losses were described in careful margin notes, and none of that mattered in the way it should have until the legal apparatus finished processing it. What breaks the injunction? Riven asked. Cole looked at him. Multiple sources, he said. If the evidence came to my office through more than one route, if the ledgers are corroborated by testimony that exists independently, by documentation obtained through legal means, by witnesses who provide sworn statements before an authorized federal officer. He paused. Then the injunction's premise weakens. It argues that the only evidence is the illegally obtained material. If there's independent evidence, that argument collapses. Riven was quiet. He was thinking. The copies, he said. Cole raised an eyebrow. Voss keeps records because records are his weapon, Riven said. He documents everything, which means somewhere there are copies. Bank examiners have visited that bank. Cole, you said yourself that a preliminary inquiry was done 3 years ago after Ward wrote to you. Those examiners would have reviewed documentation. Some of what's in those ledgers would appear, in different form, in officially submitted bank records. Not the real versions, the ones designed for examination, but the 2 versions compared show the discrepancy. Cole was very still. That inquiry, he said slowly. The examiner's report is filed with the Territory Land Office, which is legal documentation, Riven said, obtained through an official process. And if the official version and the real version show different numbers for the same properties, the discrepancy is the evidence, Cole said. He was already reaching for his files. The examiner's report would show what Voss told the Territory his loan terms and collateral arrangements were. The ledgers show what they actually were. He found the file, opened it, began reading with the specific intensity of a man who is looking for something he has reason to believe is there. Riven waited. It took 12 minutes. Cole set his finger on a page. The Tilson property, he said, listed in the examination report as collateral on a loan with standard default provisions. In the ledger, the real default trigger, Riven said. Different clause entirely. Cole looked up. They don't match. How many properties are in the examination report? Cole was already counting. 31, he said, for Black Hollow alone. If even a portion of them show discrepancies against the ledger entries, it's not illegally obtained evidence, Riven said. It's a comparison between a public document and a private one. The public document is legally clean. The private one is corroborating. Cole sat back. He had the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased, which was a rarer expression than it should have been on anyone's face. That doesn't eliminate the injunction, he said, but it gives us a legal argument that the ledgers are now secondary evidence, not primary. Prentice's motion loses most of its teeth. How long to make that argument? Riven asked. 2 days, Cole said. Maybe 3. And I need to get requests out to the land offices in the other counties. Harwick, Dry Creek, all of them. If those examination reports exist and show the same pattern, they'll show the same pattern, Riven said. Voss didn't change his system. He just moved it. Cole was already writing. The systematic energy in the room had shifted. It had gone from the grinding patience of waiting to something with direction, and the direction was visible and it was towards something. 3 days later, the injunction was contested and suspended pending further adjudication, which was a legal phrase that meant it was still technically in place, but had been effectively set aside while the court processed Cole's counter-argument. The investigators from the district office arrived. 4 of them, led by a woman named Hargrove, who had the precise, unimpressed manner of someone who had worked corruption cases for 15 years and was not going to be moved by anything except evidence, which was exactly what she needed. Riven spent 2 full days in a room with Hargrove and her team, going through the ledgers entry by entry, providing context, explaining what he'd been told and by whom and when. It was meticulous work. It was the kind of work that felt, from the inside, like it was moving too slowly, and Hargrove told him twice, without being unkind, that it was moving at the speed it needed to move, and that speed was not negotiable. He called in the witness accounts, not himself, through legal channels, through Hargrove and her team, who traveled to Black Hollow with a federal warrant that Merritt's original warrant couldn't touch. Ward met them at the edge of town in his sheriff's uniform, which he was wearing with the specific intentionality of a man who has decided what it means again. He brought them to Gideon, to Mae Tilson, to Damon Reed, who came out of the Kettrick place looking like he'd had 3 difficult days alone with himself and was ready to stop having them. The testimony was given. Sworn statements, properly witnessed, entered into the official record. Mae Tilson's was the longest. She sat at her table in the back of the dry goods store, and she told the truth about every year of it. The original loan, the terms as she'd understood them. The moment Briggs had arrived with the paper that said her understanding was wrong. The extra payments that didn't reduce the number. The way she'd learned to count not in dollars, but in months. How many months she had before the next review. How many months before the next possible trigger. She said it all plainly, without drama, in the voice of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and has decided she is done holding it and is setting it on this official table so that someone else can carry it now. The investigator who took her statement asked when Mae finished if she needed a moment. Mae looked at her. "I've been needing a moment for 3 years," she said. "I'll be fine now." "What?" Voss's lawyer contested the testimony's admissibility. He filed 3 separate motions in 4 days and argued them with impressive precision. He was good at his job and he knew the system well, and he found every procedural thread that was findable. But the system, when it was working the way it was supposed to, was also good at its job. Hargrove's team had been careful. The chain of custody was clean. The comparison evidence, the land office examination reports against the real ledgers, was unimpeachable because it compared 2 sets of documents that were both obtained through legitimate processes, and the comparison itself was the evidence. Prentice's motions were denied, one after another, in the way that well-constructed motions are denied when the underlying case is solid. Not dramatically, not finally, but conclusively enough that Voss would have felt each one as the tightening of something he couldn't loosen. Riven heard about each denial by wire. He was still in the capital, technically, under Cole's informal protective arrangement, not confined, not a prisoner, but present. He read the wires in the marshal's office, and he tried to feel relief and mostly felt the particular vigilance of a man who has learned that the absence of bad news is not the same as good news, and that Voss had not yet exhausted himself. He hadn't. The night after the 3rd motion was denied, someone broke the window of Mae Tilson's store. No one was inside, nothing was taken. It was a rock, thrown from the street, and it landed among the dry goods and left glass across 3 rows of merchandise, and a message that didn't need to be written down to be understood. Ward arrested the man who'd thrown it within 2 hours, one of Briggs's regulars, caught because he'd been seen by 2 separate people and hadn't been clever about his exit. The arrest was clean, the charge was simple, and it gave Ward something he hadn't had in 4 years, a legitimate, provable, documented action by one of Voss's men that was unambiguously criminal and unambiguously on record. He wrote to Cole about it that same night. The wireback was brief, noted. Document everything. More coming soon. Riven read that wire in the morning and understood what more coming soon meant. He'd been waiting for it. He'd told Mae, he'd told Cole, he'd told anyone who would listen. The testimony was not enough by itself. The ledgers and the examination report comparison were not enough by itself. What was needed was the full weight of all of it together, and the time for that weight to be assembled by people whose authority couldn't be challenged. More coming soon meant the district office had seen what Hargrove's team was sending back and had made a decision. It meant the case had grown past what could be contained to one territory and one marshal's office. It meant the circles on Cole's map, Harwick, Dry Creek, Millfield, Austin's Crossing, were now being examined by people who had the authority to examine them. It meant Voss's careful, patient empire had been seen in its full shape for the first time. Riven sat in Cole's office that morning and thought about what that meant. Not the legal outcome. That was still ahead, still uncertain in its specifics, still dependent on things that hadn't happened yet. But the fact of being seen. The fact that the shape of it was visible now to people who could do something about it. For years, it had operated in the space between what was obvious and what was provable. Voss had been brilliant at maintaining that space, keeping himself just far enough from the obvious that the provable stayed out of reach. That space was closing now. And once it closed, the patience that had built the empire couldn't hold it. "You know what I keep thinking about," Riven said. Cole looked up from his desk. "Frank Perkins," Riven said. "Mae mentioned him. Lost his farm last spring, left town. She didn't know where he went." Cole was quiet. "There'll be more like him," Riven said. "People who already left, who took the loss and moved on because there was nothing else to do. He paused. "This is going to help the people who are still there, but there are people who already lost everything and scattered." Cole looked at him steadily. "The restitution process, if we get to prosecution, would address prior losses," he said. "It's slow, it's imperfect, it doesn't give back the years." He paused. "But the record will exist, and the record can be used to locate and notify people who had claims." It wasn't enough. Riven knew it wasn't enough. But it was something. The specific something of a system that, when it worked, could reach back to people who had assumed they were past reaching. He thought about Mae saying, "Don't lose them." The real lives in the real ledgers. He hadn't. But the work wasn't done. Not by a long distance. And the part that came next, the part that determined whether all of this meant anything concrete, whether Voss's empire actually fell or simply reorganized itself in a different county, that part was still ahead, and it was going to require things that hadn't been asked yet from people who were already tired. Riven Cross had ridden into Black Hollow looking for water and a quiet place to rest. He was 40 miles from Black Hollow, his arm was healing, his horse was in a good stable, and the quiet was nowhere in sight. He picked up Cole's next wire from the stack on the desk. He read it. He set it down. "When are your investigators going back to Black Hollow?" he asked. Cole looked at him. "Tomorrow," he said. "Why?" "Because I should be there," Riven said. "Warrant or not, I should be there when it happens." Cole looked at him for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who is going to say something practical and is deciding how practical to make it sound. "The warrant is technically still active," he said. "Merritt hasn't withdrawn it." "I know," Riven said. "If Voss's people move against you while you're in Black Hollow without federal protection—" "I know," Riven said again. Cole exhaled slowly. "I'll ride with the team," he said. "Personally." He said it the way a man says a thing he'd already decided before the conversation started, which was probably true. "That provides you some cover, but Cross—" He paused. "Voss is going to know we're coming. He's had days to prepare." "He's been preparing since the morning I said no at the water trough," Riven said. "That hasn't stopped anything so far." Cole looked at him. He almost did the thing with the eyes again, the expression that lived where a smile would be on a different face. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We leave at first light." Riven nodded. He thought about Shadow in the stable, the stone bruise on the left front hoof that had had 4 days to improve. He'd check it tonight. He'd need the horse ready. He thought about Black Hollow waiting, about Ward holding the line with the particular stubbornness of a man who had rediscovered what he was doing it for, about Gideon, who had a bucket of water and a measure of grain, and the patience of someone who has outlasted things that seemed unsurvivable and knows that patience is its own kind of weapon. About Mae Tilson, glass in her merchandise, chin up, waiting for what came next. He was going back. And this time, he wasn't going alone. They rode into Black Hollow at mid-morning, 6 riders total, Cole and Hargrove, and 2 of her investigators, Chet and Riven. And the town that had spent years learning to look away did something different this time. It looked. People stopped on the boardwalks. A woman at the entrance of the general store shielded her eyes against the sun and watched them come. A man who'd been loading a cart put down what he was carrying, not with fear, or not only with fear, with something that had been compressed for a long time and was now tentatively expanding, the way a bruised thing slowly tests whether it can bear weight again. Ward was waiting at the edge of the main street. He was in full uniform, badge visible, standing beside his horse rather than on it, the posture of a man who has planted himself somewhere and intends to stay. He looked older than he had 5 days ago. He also looked clearer. "Voss is in the bank," Ward said when they pulled up. "Prentice left yesterday. Briggs and 2 men are still in town. The rest scattered when they heard the investigators were coming back." He looked at Cole. "Voss hasn't run." "No," Cole said. "He wouldn't." That was true, Riven thought. Running was an admission, and Voss had spent his career avoiding admissions. He would stay and he would argue, and he would make them go through every procedural step, because that was how men like Voss fought. Through the process itself, turning the mechanism of justice into another thing they could slow down and redirect. They dismounted. Cole and Hargrove went directly to the bank. Ward fell in beside them, which was his right and his jurisdiction. Riven stayed back, because the warrant with his name on it was still technically active, and walking into a confrontation with Voss while carrying an active warrant was the kind of thing that could be used against the case in ways he didn't want to hand to Prentice. He stood in the street with Chet and watched the bank door close behind Cole and Ward. "You all right?" Chet asked. "I've been more all right," Riven said honestly. The street was quiet in the particular way of a place holding its breath. A dog crossed from one side to the other with the aimless certainty of a dog that has no stakes in anything. Somewhere behind him, Riven heard a door open and then stay open, and he knew without looking that people were coming out to watch, because this was the moment that either meant something or didn't, and after years of things not meaning anything, people wanted to see it with their own eyes. The confrontation in the bank lasted 40 minutes. Riven heard none of it directly. He learned it afterward from Ward, who told him about it in the measured, careful voice of a man still deciding what he felt about what he'd witnessed. Voss had been sitting at his desk when they came in. He'd looked at Cole and Hargrove and he'd looked at Ward, and the only thing that had changed in his face was a slight compression around the eyes, the expression of a man making a final calculation and finding the numbers don't come out in his favor. He'd asked for Prentice. Cole had told him Prentice could be reached by wire and that Voss was welcome to do that, but that the formal delivery of a federal arrest warrant was not contingent on his lawyer's presence. Voss had read the warrant. He'd read it twice. He'd set it on the desk and pressed his palm flat against it. A gesture Ward said he'd never forget, the way a man tries to hold down a piece of paper by physical force when there's nothing left to hold it down with legally. He'd said, very quietly, "This won't stand." Cole had said, "That's for the court to determine." And that had been essentially the end of Calder Voss's empire. Not a dramatic ending, no shouting, no violence, no single moment of theatrical reckoning. Just a man who had built everything on the gap between what was obvious and what was provable, sitting at his desk watching that gap close, and having no answer for it except the habits of patience and process that had served him for years and had now run out of road. Harlan Briggs left town that same afternoon, which was the information Ward delivered to Riven with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a bully to discover his own smallness. The 2 remaining men who'd worked for Voss drifted away over the following day, one by one, the way organizations dissolve when the center doesn't hold. Not dramatically, just gone. The trial, when it came, was held in the territorial capital. It took 3 months to get there and another 6 weeks to complete. Riven was called as a witness, and he went, and he sat in the stand and answered every question with the same directness he'd used on the street that first morning, and Prentice, who had stayed on as Voss's lawyer through the whole proceeding, because even men who build empires on fraud have the right to a defense, Cross-examined him for an hour and found nothing to work with because there was nothing to work with. The discrepancy evidence, the land office examination reports against the real ledgers, was the structural center of the prosecution's case. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Two versions of the same transactions, one official and clean, one real and damning, and the distance between them measured in years of other people's lives. 31 separate counts of fraud, conspiracy to defraud in 4 counties, corruption of a public official, Judge Merritt, who had issued the warrant against Riven, and who turned out to be a man who'd been deceived rather than bought, a distinction that mattered legally and not at all to the people who'd been hurt. Merritt withdrew the warrant personally and publicly, which was the thing that allowed Riven to stop managing the particular exhaustion of moving through a world where his name was attached to a crime he hadn't committed. Voss was found guilty on 23 of the 31 counts. The other 8 were dismissed on procedural grounds that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the specific architecture of proof. Prentice was very good at his job, but 23 counts was enough. The sentence was 20 years. Riven heard about it by wire. I was in Black Hollow when the news came. He drifted back there during the months of proceedings, not because he had a plan to stay, but because there were things unresolved, and he didn't leave unresolved things well. He read the wire in Mae Tilson's store because she'd asked him to bring her the news directly when it came, and he'd said he would, and he had. She read it herself, taking the wire from his hand and reading it twice the way Ward had described Voss reading his own warrant. Then she set it on the counter, and she didn't cry, and she didn't celebrate. She put both hands flat on the counter and stood there for a moment, and the quality of the silence was the quality of something put down that had been heavy. 20 years, she said. Yes, Riven said. She looked at him. Frank Perkins, she said. His farm. The restitution process is open, Riven said. Cole's office sent notifications. If Frank Perkins is findable, he'll come back, Mae said. When he knows. She paused. People come back when they know it's safe to. Riven thought about that. About the ones who would come back and the ones who wouldn't for whatever reason. Too far gone, too changed, too much time between who they were and who they'd need to be to start again. The restitution process was real, and it was open, and it was also imperfect and slow, and the gap between a legal remedy and an actual life put back together was wide enough that some people would fall into it. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly, no matter how many counts the jury came back with. He said as much to Mae because she deserved honesty more than comfort. She nodded. I know, she said, but some is more than none. She looked at him with the directness that had been there from the first night, when she'd let 3 men into her back door and given them coffee and pointed at a ledger entry and said, "Those are real people's lives. You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" he said. "The morning Briggs came in here with that paper," she said. "I was 61 years old. I'd run this store for 30 years. And I picked up that paper and I felt like I was 12 years old and someone had explained something to me in a language I didn't understand, and it was my fault for not understanding it." She paused. That's what he was counting on. Not just the legal trick, the feeling. That feeling that the system is too big and too complicated and you're too small to fight it, so you just take whatever it says and try to survive. Riven was quiet. "You walking up to that trough and saying no," Mae said. "That was the beginning of the feeling going away. Not all at once, but a crack in it." She looked at him. "I want you to know that. In case you ever wonder whether it was worth the arm and the night and all the rest of it." He didn't have a neat answer for that. He didn't try to make one. "I'm glad you told me," he said. Damon Reed gave his full testimony, including the 3 years he didn't want to talk about. He'd worked something out in the Kettrick place over those long days alone. Or not quite worked it out, but gotten honest with himself about it in a way that staying busy had previously allowed him to avoid. He sat in front of Hargrove's investigators, and he told them what he'd done, and what he'd known, and when he'd known it, and he didn't minimize it, and he didn't perform contrition. He just said the facts in the order they happened, and let the facts be what they were. He was not charged. The investigation determined that his role, while substantial, had been that of an employee following instructions rather than a designer or beneficiary of the system, and that his cooperation was material and had made the case substantially stronger. There were people in Black Hollow who didn't forgive him, and he seemed to understand that was reasonable. He stayed in town. He got work at the lumber operation that started up on the south edge of town after the Kettrick land changed hands legally for the first time in years. Riven talked to him once, near the end of his time in Black Hollow, in the stable where this had all started. Damon was helping Gideon with something, a fence repair, the kind of small, useful work that a man finds when he's trying to be somewhere instead of just being someone. "You staying?" Riven asked. Damon looked at the fence board he was holding. "For a while," he said. "I don't know how long." He looked up. "You?" "No," Riven said. Damon nodded, like he'd expected that. "Ward's taking it all right," he said. "Better than I thought he would." The territory investigation. They looked at his conduct and found it insufficient but not corrupt. He gets to keep the badge. A pause. "He seems like he actually wants it again. He searched for the right word. "That's good to see." Riven agreed that it was. Gideon appeared from the other side of the stable with 2 nails in his mouth and the expression of a man who has heard everything and is choosing not to comment on it, which was, Riven had come to understand, Gideon's highest form of respect. He spit the nails into his palm and looked at Riven. "Shadow's ready," he said. "I know," Riven said. "I checked him this morning." "I know you checked him," Gideon said. "I checked him after you did." Riven looked at him. "Was something wrong?" "No," Gideon said. "I just wanted to check." It was the most Gideon thing Gideon had ever said, and Riven stood with it for a moment and didn't try to improve on it. He left on a Thursday morning, which was an ordinary Thursday with no particular weather and no ceremony attached to it, which was how he preferred it. Ward shook his hand at the edge of town. He'd come out alone, which Riven appreciated. No crowd, no send-off. Just a man in a sheriff's badge at the place where the town ended and the road began. "You ever come back through this way?" Ward said. "I know where the trough is," Riven said. Ward almost smiled, the version of it that lived around the eyes. "The warrant's withdrawn," he said, "officially, as of last week. You're a free man in this territory." "Good to know," Riven said, and he meant it more than he let on, because there was something about carrying a warrant with your name on it that occupied a specific piece of your attention all the time, like a sound you've been hearing so long you stopped noticing it, and now that it's gone you can feel the absence. He swung up on to Shadow. The horse moved under him with the settled readiness of an animal that knew what departure felt like and was not opposed to it. "Cross," Ward said. Riven looked back. Ward looked at him for a moment, the look of a man who has something to say that he's not entirely sure how to say. "That first morning," he said, "when you said no at the trough. I was watching from the alley. I saw the whole thing." A pause. "I've been a sheriff for 11 years. I've been in 100 situations that required someone to just say no clearly. And I watched a stranger do it who'd been in town for 20 minutes, and I stood in an alley and did nothing." He said it flat, without self-pity. "I'm telling you this because you should know that what you did mattered before it mattered. Before the ledgers, before Cole, before any of it. That moment was when something changed in me. I don't know if that's worth anything to you." Riven sat with it for a moment. "It's worth something," he said. He turned Shadow north. He didn't look back. Not because there was nothing worth looking at, but because he'd learned a long time ago that looking back while you were moving was how you missed what was coming. There is something that takes a long time to learn, and some people never do. That the systems built to protect us are only as strong as the people inside them who decide to hold the line. Not the perfect people. There are no perfect people. The ones who have already looked away, already compromised, already let it go on too long. The question is not whether you have a clean record. The question is what you do when the moment arrives and you finally understand you're in one. Elias Ward stood in an alley for too long, but he came out of it. Damon Reed worked for a man he knew was wrong, but he told the truth when it mattered. Mae Tilson was afraid every day for 3 years, but she opened her back door at night to 3 men carrying stolen evidence because she knew what it was worth. None of them were heroes in the simple sense. None of them were saved by their own purity. They were saved by something smaller and more durable than that, by the decision, made imperfectly and late and with full knowledge of their own failure, to be useful in the moment they were actually in. Riven Cross rode away from Black Hollow, carrying nothing that didn't belong to him. The fraudulent claim against Shadow had been formally dissolved as part of the restitution proceedings. The horse was legally, unambiguously his, which it always had been, but paperwork has weight in the world, and the paperwork now matched the truth. He had no destination planned. He had a road north and a horse that moved well, and the particular feeling of a man who has set something down and is discovering, as his hands come empty, what they want to reach for next. For years, he'd been moving away from things. That was the honest description of it. Not running. Running was the word people used when they wanted to make movement sound shameful, and movement wasn't shameful. Movement was sometimes the most intelligent response to a set of circumstances. But there's a difference between moving away from something and moving towards something, and Riven had spent long enough in the first category to know what the second one felt like when it showed up. It felt, he thought, like this. Not like certainty. Not like arrival. Just like a direction that wasn't away. Shadow moved steady beneath him, and the road opened ahead, and Black Hollow disappeared into the distance behind him, the way all places do when you leave them. First smaller, then absent, then only present as the particular weight a place leaves in a person who passed through it and was changed. He rode north. The morning held its ordinary light. The road was just a road. And the man on the black horse with the 4 white socks was, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, not escaping